Morning. Welcome everybody to the second day, Incredible Machines, Digitality and Modern Systems of Knowledge at the Threshold of the 21st Century. My name is Alison Collins and I'll just be introducing today's panel. As we did yesterday, we'll start the day off with about 3 20-minute presentations in succession, starting with Mackenzie Warwick, followed by Michael Farah and Nick Cernicek. We'll have then a keynote presentation by Suhail Malik, which will be followed by a response to the keynote by Martha Schwendener. So before we break for lunch, we'll have a bit of a roundtable discussion generated by short responses to each of the presentations, leaving a little bit of time for questions from the audience and also from the streaming audience. So I'll ask you just to keep your questions until the end. So in order to keep on track, I'll just remind all the speakers we are a little bit behind, but just to try to remain within your allocated time. So to begin, we're going to start with Mackenzie Warwick. I'm pleased to introduce him. He's a professor of culture and media art at the New School for Social Research, hi, and the author of A Hacker Manifesto, Gamer Theory, and Telesthesia, among various other things. His presentation today is called Prolet Cult for Cyborgs. Welcome, Mackenzie.
Thank you. So, good morning, everybody. Happy International Women's Day. I hope you can hear me over there. Wow, I can actually see myself on a little screen in the big screen there. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about work in progress. It's called Molecular Red. And I thought I'd talk to it rather than read a paper because there's enough layers of estrangement here already. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is what Marx, Capital Volume 3, called molecular rift. Molecular rift. The sense that, and he wasn't even aware of it in his time, but the big one in our era is carbon. You know, carbon is in the wrong place. Carbon that was in the ground is now in the air. That's a problem. But there are others. Phosphorus is in the wrong place. Nitrogen is in the wrong place. And by wrong, I mean in ways that don't create feedback loops, but where you start to create runaway processes that head in directions we can't even model and don't even quite grasp. The big one's climate, but there are other ones. So it seems to me that the problem of constructing critical knowledge in the 21st century really has to take the question of metabolic rift as its kind of central concern. Of all of the liberation fronts of the 20th century, we got somewhere with some of these in terms of liberating women, people of color, of liberating the working class, but the liberation movement that succeeded above all others was the liberation of carbon. I mean, we liberated an element into the atmosphere, and I think one needs to sort of rethink the history of the 20th century sort of around that fact and the subsidiary ones that perspective then opens up. And we put methane in the wrong place as well, and so on. So rather than talk about totality as Lukács did, can we talk about biosphere as what totality now is? So the paradox of the 20th century is, on the one hand, this astonishing improvement in the capacity to create information systems, and yet at the same time the kind of thermodynamic system that underlies the whole thing is kind of totally out of whack. So we've kind of expanded the noosphere of the digital, if you like, on the one hand, but the underlying metabolic processes on the molecular level that would sustain that are in really not very good shape at all. So it seems to me that if there's a body of knowledge upon which one needs to base a critique, it's no longer political economy, it's essentially climate science. And my source for this is this terrific book, which I highly recommend, A Vast Machine by Paul Edwards, where one can start to grasp, curiously, how one of the things that, it's only a subsidiary cause, but one of the things that advances digital technology in the 20th century was, in fact, the demand of, firstly, weather and then climate modeling. Were one of the drivers. They're a subsidiary driver to the military, of course, but those two things are also in themselves not unrelated. So, can we have a critical theory that co-joins, in a sense, these two objects? The problem of us a thermodynamic system, and then the growth of the information system on top of that. And I wanted to introduce Alexander Bogdanov as really the first person who did it. He was Lenin's rival for the leadership of the Bolshevik Party before the revolution. Lenin throws him out. He becomes a kind of a theorist. And there are a few sort of key concepts I wanted to get out of Bogdanov. And the reason was that he actually sort of got climate change almost right as an idea twice. First in about 1908, in his science fiction novel about Mars, that's called, in English, Red Star. And the second is in his work on techtology. He almost got the physics right, which is an astonishing thing to pull off in the 1920s. All right, so three Bogdanov concepts that might help us in thinking about how knowledge is produced. Is what happens in any system of knowledge what he calls a practice of substitution. So what Bogdanov means by substitution is that we extend out from the labor practices in which we're involved and start to imagine the rest of the world, a kind of a metaphysics based on that model. And he thought in essence that there'd been three, that ancient knowledge is based on authoritarian substitution, the authoritarian relations within the household and the Greek polity get expanded out to the cosmos. He thought there was a second substitutional model based on exchange, and it coincides with the kind of rise of political economy, of modern science, and so forth. And his goal was the production of a third. Is there such a thing as a kind of comradely set of relations that one can imagine in everyday life that one could then use as the basis for building a metaphysics that's not either of the other two? And it strikes me that in looking at what's happened in so much of contemporary thought, I kind of see substitution based on models of exchange, based on models of authority, as if we didn't really make any progress in thinking through the relation between how knowledge would be organized and how one would then construct the metaphysical extension of that out into the world. That's, if you like, always the penumbra around how one thinks. So for Bogdanov, what he proposed was a techtology. Can there be techtology? Can there be comradely relations among different kinds of knowledge that understand the relation between how knowledge is organized, how one would then construct the metaphysical extension of that out into the world? I just started to hear myself back again. And just to introduce another really key Bogdanov idea, Prolet Cult. He's the author of the idea that what really matters is the production of culture by the people and for the people. So it's to start, if you like, questioning property and knowledge and property and culture was one of the things Bogdanov starts to do in the early 20th century. And for a while he even had his own rival organization to the Bolshevik Party after the revolution, but it sort of quickly gets shut down by the Leninist Party. All right, so is there a way to take this as a model of critical thought for our time? Firstly, because Bogdanov kind of gets it, that one has to think political economy within a kind of biospheric economy. Secondly, because he starts to think about, here's a theory of knowledge that we tend to sort of recycle these metaphors that are really just extensions of forms of social relation, particularly authoritarian ones, or in the model of exchange. And would it be possible to do that in a kind of playful, creative manner based on the kind of comradely co-production of knowledge? So, to me, that seems like a reasonable starting point for thinking the problem of how one might engage as a critical intellectual in the larger problem of how does one start to realign the totality of information relations with the thermodynamic relations that underlie them. Because if we don't solve that problem, then we're not really accelerating anywhere anytime soon. We're going to have to be doing remedial work to patch up all of the damage that's done. So, I just want to take a couple of minutes to say, if anybody accidentally starts to reinvent Bogdanovism in the 20th century, it was Donna Haraway. I find her thought is kind of quite striking in the way that, like Bogdanov, she was interested in the biological sciences rather than just political economy. and how one then starts to think from the point of view of a collective agent. And if for Bogdanoff it was still classically the working class, in Haraway she started to think, we are all cyborgs. What is, if you like, a kind of cyborg being, one can think, so that one doesn't assume in advance that there's a separation of subject and object. One doesn't think in advance, one could, in Bogdanoff's terms, define working class. One doesn't construct a philosophy that assumes in advance that there is subject and there is object, which you'll notice speculative realism is still doing. It still kind of takes this, it doesn't really question the basic presumption of the categories. It just wants to change the relation between them. So it's to ask this other question, is how are cuts between subjects and objects produced in the first place? Will, I think, take you to the productivism of Bogdanoff, or in 21st century form, into something like the figure of the cyborg. Now, Haraway is well aware that all of us are creatures of what we would now call this, military entertainment complex. There isn't an outside. We have to kind of stop thinking that there's an outside from which one can think about these things. We're inside it. We're produced by it. And what it's producing, above all else, is kind of a third nature. If there was a second nature that collective labor produced over and against, a nature which it then calls into being as a category, what we're seeing in the age of the digital is a kind of a third nature that seizes hold of that second nature, but is building something out of it that's not thermodynamically sustainable. And, I can only sort of rattle through this quickly, but one could ask, well, what constitutes the power that would organize the planet in such a form? Maybe there is a new kind of ruling class. I called it the vectoral class. Maybe power in this day and age is based on control of stocks, flows, and vectors of communication. There's a move away from the actual physical control of industrial production to a kind of third-order control, not of the resource, not of its means of transformation, but control and command of the information system. Maybe it's a ruling class whose goal is not surplus value, but surplus information. And after all, this whole apparatus we're using today, it's basically, subsidiary to Google's attempt to extract surplus information out of us in order to create a new engine of business. It may or may not succeed. It may or may not be a new mode of production. But I think the question has to be asked. Is this just capitalism as usual, or is it something worse? My proposition to you is that maybe it's something worse. So, if there's a field of knowledge one might start to construct, maybe we need to think about the digital inhumanities. It seemed like such a big thing that we would put digital on the front of humanities, but what if it's the inhumanities? What if we were to look at the production of power over and against some notion of self, the production of versions of a cyborg being that aren't really terribly habitable or sustainable? And if one started from that critical point of view, one might then at least be able to tease out what other kinds of cyborg being would we like? What other kinds of organization or power and knowledge do we think are possible? Can we take everyday life as a site for the construction of experiments in other ways of life that don't try to extract us from our embeddedness, our connectedness, our cyborg being, but repurpose it, detone it, that construct another way of life? And if there's a last project for art, it might be in that very domain, to think about what the everyday in the era of third nature might constitutively be. So I will leave it there, and thank you for your patience with the mediated communication.
All right, thank you, Mackenzie. I'm going to turn on the other microphone here real quick. Okay, please go ahead. Sorry about that.
That's all right. Thanks. Next up, we'll have Michael Farah. Michael Farah is an insurgent scholar living in Portland, Oregon. He was previously creative director at Spooky Action in St. Louis, a leading venue for experimental music and performance. He's written about neuroscience and continental philosophy, the ludic impulse in 20th century art, and contemporary electronic music. The title of his presentation is Outline for a Recursive Curriculum. Welcome, Michael.
Pardon me, Michael is not actually in in Vancouver, correct?
I'm going to explain what's going on with Michael.
Yeah, Michael was actually like supposed to be here with us, but he had problems with his passport and all that, so he couldn't make it. So he's just like setting up his system. So I thought maybe if we
Why don't we have a discussion? Why don't we?
I just want to see if Robin can like respond right now. If Robin can get on, it's like as if not having Ken's paper earlier wasn't bad enough. I'm putting him on spot to do his, and then by then Michael will be like setting up and joining us. No, you don't need to do that because like other people can also comment on Ken's piece, but you're here, so maybe you want to start it. So Robin will introduce himself.
Hi, good morning. My name is Robin Simpson. I'm a graduate student in art history at UBC. So unfortunately, as like Ken sort of demonstrated with his presentation, this is something that he's thinking through. So I didn't have an opportunity necessarily to read what anything that he had prepared in advance, but I sort of counted my blessings that I was assigned Ken to respond to, because I think as you've seen from his presentation from afar, he's deft and agile pedagogue and orator, and delivers his ideas in quite a clear and generous fashion, which I admire a great deal. So all I really knew was that we might talk about Alexander Bogdanoff and Donna Haraway. Bogdanoff I hadn't really heard of before, but of course, all right, I sort of heard rumors about him, this sort of Soviet polymath that had, I think, later practiced sort of experiments in blood transfusion and sort of extending life, but also early sort of like proto-systems theorist and developing sort of early ideas of what would speak to cybernetics, which I think Ken already demonstrated a bit, and then also his engagement with Prolet Cult and early engagement with art as well. So it seemed like an exciting topic and such, but I was also interested, it was nice that Donna Haraway was inserted in there, not even inserted, but as sort of the second part of what Ken was thinking through. And it was just such a pleasure to reread Haraway's manifesto, which I think sort of given like the other manifesto that's sort of hanging over this conference, if I had to choose amongst manifestos, my favorite manifesto, I might maybe choose Haraway's over the Accelerationist Manifesto. And I think just sort of in particular, there's one thing in the Manifesto for Acceleration Politics which sort of sits kind of potent today, but Mo addressed a bit at the beginning, that there's point 15 in the third part where it's written, we do not present any particular organization as the means to embody these vectors. What is needed and what has always been needed is an ecology of organizations, a pluralism of forces, resonating and feeding back on their comparative strengths. Sectarianism is the death knell of the left as much as centralization is, and in this regard we continue to welcome experimentation with different tactics, even those we disagree with. So I'm sort of soapboxing a bit here, but I really find that this sort of point 15 in the third part is there's a sort of detectable ennui in this statement compared to the surrounding points that really enliven this manifesto. And it reads like a sort of rote caveat of sorts. It seems to preemptively define acceleration's homosocial makeup. And so I kind of struggle to locate any palpable declaration of affinity in this statement compared to what Haraway activates in her essay. And particularly what I admire about Haraway is her capacity to recognize existing sort of analogs to her thought, and also more frequently to learn from existing activities and means of creative resistance. And so there's sort of three sort of examples that she offers in her manifesto and the Cyborg Manifesto, which is the Livermore Action Group, the Service Employees International Union, and also anthropologist Ai Weiong's or Awa Ong's studies of the role of Southeast Asian women, village women in Japanese and American electronics firms. And so, there's a strength in that sort of thinking through affinities, and there's an object lesson in the form of Haraway's manifesto that I find is noticeably absent from the accelerationist manifesto. But so okay, should I keep talking? I have more content, yeah. There's sort of like two parts to this. That was sort of the first part. And the second part is more about art. And it sort of has a title that would be sort of like USB stick in a brick of concrete. And it's something that Mo talked about at the beginning of the conference yesterday, where he was he was talking about art and asking artists, I think to quote him, to quit playing around and get serious about sort of the consequences of thinking about computation within a capitalist system and its effects on forms and its effects on visual culture. And so I had my suspicions when he said that, and I might be wrong about this, but I think that like some of the art in question he's thinking about was all assembled last year at this exhibition in Kassel that was entitled Speculations on Anonymous Materials. And this exhibition was complemented by a symposium bringing together, you know, some of the thinkers that you might expect, considering the title. Reza, of course, was speaking there. And so I've kind of been lingering on this show. I haven't seen it, just sort of looked at it online, and sort of viewing it from afar. And despite the call to get serious, I'm sort of wondering if maybe it's worth briefly considering some of the work that's alluded to in this exhibition. You know, even if it's kind of, in my opinion, from a distance, sort of like miserable and like bourgeois art, even if you're not supposed to use that word anymore. And so under question are these artists who really just sort of delight in suspending their encounter with advertising systems, which, you know, algorithmic sort of advertising systems that, where are we? You know, that depend on some sort of monitoring of our activity or our social activity, whatever we're generating. And a lot of these artists have statements that are peppered with general outlines of how these systems work. And but what I detect is actually sort of an underlying spirit of collaboration with corporate entities, and there's some nihilism behind that. And what I think is actually kind of like this this sort of paranoid genealogy, where there's this sort of there's this desperate sort of like search for information that was once suspended or surrendered, or that we're always sort of like hemorrhaging and leaking out. And so on social networks, work writes that, you know, we as users, we pay rent with our information. And he's spoken to this sort of vector class that are, of course, figuring out means of harvesting this information, whether it's a viable system or not, economic system or not, is up for debate, or means of accumulation. This contract is always sort of, what do we have here? Oh yeah, I guess it's like that contract's always assured because like we all have this sense that, you know, whatever information we're giving about is probably pretty useless, especially as artists and intellectuals. Like maybe as activists, there's something worth sort of calling about their sort of ideas of, or any sort of like dissenting ideas, but otherwise, really just kind of like nominal tiny bits of information, like what's it really worth, the frequency that you log in, or, you know, there's a larger network, of course, maybe there's something that it amounts to, but we just sort of understand that, well, we'll put up with dealing with all these corporate entities because we're not really providing all that much. But I think also that for these artists, that there's a sense that actually they're more sort of, and this sort of speaks to what Mackenzie was talking about a bit in terms of ecology and natural resources and the dependence on natural resources for technological development, is that these users are positioned more so as a sort of like raw natural resource that rather than being some example variable capital that to engage with social networks or to surrender your data is in part this sort of you end up being more so some form of constant capital. And maybe that's a sort of like dumb Marxism, but it's kind of dumb art, so we can leave it at that. So what maybe occurs through these exchanges is that there's more of a transference of information, no matter how nominal, that in some way contributes to the look and feel of any number of products, so that we understand that our information actually sort of contours the aesthetics of the world, or the aesthetics of products, the aesthetics of screen culture. And so, just all these bad advertisements that try to get us to stick. And we kind of find it amusing because, again, we have all these heterogeneous interests, and none of these things ever seem right. They never seem to find an ad that can really catch our attention or actually match us. But I think there's also this sense for these artists who are in this exhibition that there's this sort of exchange of information is sort of a genetic, this is the cybernetic thing of it, there's this confused sort of sense that there's a genetic relationship with whatever weird, knobby, strange product shows up, or whatever advertisement ends up, or whatever string of text ends up. And so we're sort of like always left, or especially these artists are trying more so just sort of suspending this moment where they're sort of like desperately kind of like looking at this material and kind of wondering about their information, like, where did my information go? Is it going to do anything? Is it going to make a difference? Will that corporation buy it? Will they like it? Will they make use of it? Will I ever see it again? Can I ever see what my information has done? Can I see it here in this unwanted product, or this useless service, or this annoying ad? It must be delivered to me because there's some affiliation, there's some sort of relationship that I have with this at some point. So, yeah.
Just before you leave the stage, I was gonna ask you. I was actually indirectly referring to that exhibition. I wasn't holding up that exhibition as a model.
No. Well, it's this what I understand. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
I just to make it clear because I was kind of indirectly actually referring to that exhibition.
Yeah. Well, that is what I sort of recognized, and I feel obviously that you brought it up as well because there seems to be a contrast in terms of a symposium that was organized that undergirded the exhibition of sorts, and then a name that itself was affected by a series of theory and ideas that are making their way through the art world.
Hey, Robert.
Yeah.
Can I direct a quick question to you before you sit down?
Yeah.
That idea of the ads never matching our own, desires and interests. Don't want to write the algorithm never exactly right that you were talking about a minute ago. There's annoying ads that pop up and so on. I think in some ways that's Algebra 101 in the sense that it's a moment of failed interpolation by the ad. But that's when interpolation takes place. That's when we emerge as the digital subject or the online proletariat or whatever. Is when we say, well, why is it gay ESL belly fat ads on Facebook? Why doesn't it match me, right? So like that moment of the big others not recognizing is when that interpolation is best sort of operates, even the digital. And that way that digital thing, mismatch, is updating on that structure with the thought.
Yeah, that's a great reflection on something I threw together quickly. But yeah, absolutely. But I guess if I had a question for Mackenzie, would be more sort of, again, thinking about natural resources in this proposal, thinking about a usership less as some sort of weakly tied proletariat and more so just as raw material, and what your reflection on that might be.
Yeah, thank you very much.
So, so I won't reintroduce Michael's talk, but I'll just welcome him to begin. I did that.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
I was outside.
Hi. So I'm sorry for the delay, and I'm sorry that I couldn't be there. I was really looking forward to it. About half of this is going to go very smoothly. I was prepared for an evening talk, but not a morning talk. So I'm just going to dive right in since we're running behind. The title of my paper is Outline for Recursive Curriculum. About half of this is going to go very smoothly. Then I'm going to go off script. It's fairly self-explanatory, so I'm just going to dive right in. The challenges that condition the pursuit of universal education can be roughly divided between those pertaining to its socio-political establishment and those pertaining to its pedagogical organization. While practically distinct, these are not functionally independent of one another. The stability of the project's institutional supports relies ultimately on the integrity of its didactic content, which in turn requires a substantial civil infrastructure to ensure its consistency. So long as it is treated as a generic service, addressing only the minimal requirements of socialization, public education fails to translate the political motives behind its propagation into the liberatory facilities it is promoted as supplying. A 2005 internal report evaluating UNESCO's Education for All movement highlights the crucial relationship between quality and consistency of student participation, noting that despite their routine affirmation of education as a basic right, many international instruments are silent about the qualitative dimension of learning. Assessments of the UN's Millennium Development Goal to achieve universal primary education by 2015 similarly reflect the disappointing results of erratic implementation and inadequate teacher training. Even in poor communities, where formal schooling is provided, it is often difficult to invest children and their parents in the process of education when a culture of learning is still lacking. While a global educational infrastructure might be an achievable near-future goal, this only multiplies the basis of problems that already complicate the work of schooling in the developed world, recalling attention as well to the shortcomings of approaches here. I suggest that one way to ameliorate these concerns is to redefine the methodology of general education around the imperative of its universal extension, extrapolating local infrastructural stipulations accordingly. In agreement with UNESCO's recommendations, this involves reevaluating the constructivist philosophies that have characterized the recent history of Western education and developing more explicitly structured curricula for both classroom teaching and teacher education. To take seriously the potential of universal education, we should submit equally to its demands rather than setting ourselves as its benchmark. What should count as the criteria for a form of universal education that could most fully realize its merits? We can cite three requirements to satisfy what might be called its strong definition. First, that formal education be made available to all without further qualification. Second, that it be implemented globally through a system of consistent methodological principles and standards of content. And third, that it direct itself explicitly towards its own universality. That is, that it should be transnational in its concerns and constitutive of a self-consciously cosmopolitan perspective promoted as supply. It is this last criterion that is missing from received strategies of universal education, but that could serve most clearly to direct the particulars of that mission. However, besides insufficient civil infrastructure, the major impediment to ensuring the success of any such program is the unavailability of the sort of global frame of reference it would be put in place to facilitate. So long as it is seen as imposing the values of one group upon the members of others, or as being irrelevant to their specific needs, the effort to determine an ethical or conceptual lingua franca is bound to invite suspicion and hostility. Hence, Western liberal intellectuals have defaulted for some time to a kind of relativist isolationism in the name of those communities that populate the capitalist periphery. Yet, rather than protect the oppressed from cultural aggression or economic subsumption, the isolationist prescription against universalism largely contributes to an environment of resignation towards conditions of exclusion and exploitation, so long as they are maintained by locals. If, on the contrary, we reject the notion that technical and scientific knowledge especially should be restricted by their perceived geographical provenance, and assert instead that it is by keeping these resources effectively private that we fail those groups without access to them, then we commit ourselves to the active dispersal of concepts and skills that require sophisticated training and materials to secure. This training should be understood not just in terms of a vocational practicum, but as providing a common vocabulary through which to make sense of the world as an architecture of causal mechanisms. Again, we should not approach this charge as if the world's richest nations have already fulfilled it for themselves. Rather than export or multiply entrenched pedagogies in their administrative forms, essentially unaltered, the project of universal education, strongly defined, compels the transformation of those practices as well. We can take several routes to arrive at computation as an effective, practical, and conceptual framework in which to address the demands of that project. Most immediately, the ubiquity of information and communications technology, ICT, has already forced the question of how to situate digital literacy in the curricula of the developed world. If universal education is supposed to be the instrument by which to narrow the knowledge gap between those societies where formal schooling is well established and those where it is not, the same question is raised still more pressingly in the latter contexts. This in itself reiterates the mandate that education must be developed alongside an infrastructure capable of supporting it appropriately. Schools without computers today simply cannot meet the requirements of equitable implementation. But even in those schools where digital literacy does count as an essential aspect of the curriculum, it cannot alone corral study of the implications of computational resources for the disciplines those resources now define. It can only register the historical fact that this transformation has occurred. Hence, merely fitting it into the curriculum accords ICT an axial position around which other courses become implicitly arranged, whether or not this is explicitly acknowledged. As it is increasingly enlisted throughout both schooling and daily life, digital literacy becomes indistinct from learning in general, while other subject areas must individually address the basis of their amenability to computational expression. Teaching through simulations and games doesn't just neutrally increase the range of educational media, but instead draws concentrated attention to the construction of their design and to their epistemological presumption as models. Responsibly contemporary pedagogy must be sufficiently reflexive to accommodate this shift. For example, computational thinking is promoted chiefly through its center at Carnegie Mellon, aims to expand digital skill sets to include familiarity with techniques of algorithm design, pattern recognition, decomposition, and so forth, with the goal of promoting these as a generalized approach to problem solving. This strategy has metacognitive applications as well, insofar as it inculcates an awareness of thought as rule-based input-output procedures. This refinement of human intelligence, according to the automated standards of our machines, suggests that computation, which begins by rendering logic concrete, completes the cycle of its conceptual achievement by providing the grammar of that common language we cannot otherwise establish among ourselves.
Seems like we're still live, but
we are still live. It's just that his it depends on the speed of the connection where he is.
yeah, no, he's coming on. He just like messaged me that like, sorry, hold on.
Okay.
So he might go leave the room and then come back again.
Okay.
There he is. No. Yeah, I think he's just going to come back.
Please stand by. This will just be a few minutes. Just a moment. Just a moment. I'm trying to get him in here right now. If anyone has his number, we could certainly call him directly. We didn't have a phone number for him, but if anybody has that and can share that.
Yeah, I'm trying to contact him. Maybe I can just like dial him in, so he'll just like finish his paper with the phone.
Yes, and you can just hold it right up to the. Thanks, Dana. His number, we could certainly call him directly. We didn't have a phone number for him, but if anybody has that and can share that. Mohammed, I'm not getting any response right now, so.
Yeah, don't worry. I'm just putting him on the phone. He's gonna just wrap up his paper because he already actually made his argument. He just like went for a brief to finish, and then he just lost the internet.
Okay, great.
Okay, I don't seem to be able to connect to him, so let's see if Nick is ready, and then we can always bring him back in when the discussion is going. Nick, are you there?
Hi, Nick, are you there? I just unmuted you if you're ready to go.
Yeah, I'm all set to go if you guys want.
Okay.
Okay, so go ahead.
No, just one second. Allison's going to introduce you.
I think we'll get back to starting in the room here. Welcome, Nick. Nick Cerdenchek is a teaching fellow in geopolitics and globalization at UCL and a PhD graduate in international relations from LSE. He was co-editor of The Speculative Turn and is currently writing Folk Politics with Alex Williams. His paper is called The Eyes of the State. You can see it there on the screen.
He's going to do it himself. Nick, we're ready.
About the technological and sort of infrastructural tendencies within contemporary capitalism, particularly the shift to automation and computer mediation that we see everywhere. And up on the screen now is just a sort of schematic overview, different sectors of the economy and the sort of ongoing tendencies, technological changes that I think are going on right now. So I think this is all quite closely related to Ben Bratton's work on the black stack, Tiziana Terranova's work on the red stack, and also Nick Dyer-Witherford's work on what he calls red plenty platforms. So I think this is all quite heavily interrelated. So the emphasis on this paper is going to be on the bottom two aspects, so macroeconomic forecasting and macroeconomic intervention, so particularly on this modeling aspect. And I think it's the nodal point, essentially, at which complexity, the aesthetics of cognitive mapping, and the organization of a decision-making system all sort of come together. And I think this is all important because we essentially live within a Promethean world. So we produced a world of immense complexity, vast technical infrastructure spanning the globe, speeding circuits of data and capital, unprecedented interventions into our biology, the ramifications of all of this on the environment. Yet in the face of this complexity, the left has largely turned away from questions of how to manage this complexity. Instead of grand images of collective self-emancipation through democratic control over this complexity, we instead have the romanticization of endless insurrection by people like Tikkun and the invisible community in particular, or the sort of ephemeral protest of horizontal movements like Occupy, or just the straight-out retreat into small scales by well-meaning localists. So it seems to me that the left has largely renounced any sort of Promethean venture. But as Alberto Toscano writes, diffuse anti-Promethean common sense seems to express a dangerous disavowal rather than a hard-won wisdom. So in the face of climate change, global infrastructures, and increasing complexity, the point is not whether or not we should be Promethean in our intentions. We already are in terms of our shaping of the environment, the control over our biological body, and the manipulation of the global economy. So the point is rather that this Promethean venture has so far been limited to the interest of capital accumulation, and increasingly a small portion even within the capitalist class. So the questions and problems raised by Prometheanism in large-scale social change are problems to be faced up to, not rejected out of hand. So in light of this, this paper seeks to examine how states have responded to complexity and to the global. And it argues that states have responded by developing cognitive assemblages, essentially systems of human and non-human elements, which function to produce a representation of a complex system. So we can see their existence most prominently within the climate change modeling centers, things like the Hadley Centre within the UK. And here we have the massive power of the world's leading supercomputers, mobilized to filter through billions of data points, collected by a global observation network, and all with the aim of simulating global climate change. But that being said, this use of computational technology for modeling, forecasting, and planning are increasingly ubiquitous. So insurance companies, for instance, are spending millions of dollars annually on catastrophe modeling. From this, shaping decisions about insurance premiums and the level of capital held as a buffer. You also have in the field of government energy policy, the production, distribution, and consumption of energy are all represented and understood through about 60 to 70 different models. Likewise, with financial investment and corporate investment, they're increasingly determined by things like value at risk models. And the global food system is also modeled and manipulated via computational technology. So in other words, I think what you see here is that every fundamental aspect of human society, food, energy, capital, nature, and infrastructure, is today represented computationally. So the aim of this paper is going to be to focus on these eyes of the state, in particular as they perceive and construct the national and global economy. So this paper wants to uncover the ways in which particular constructions of the economy came about, how the economy was made visible essentially, how particular levers over the economy were made possible, so how the economy became an object of manipulation, and then sort of more speculatively, what post-capitalist potentials do these modeling techniques have? So how could the economy be manipulated for the commons? So the latter essentially forms the normative thrust of this paper. And essentially, if the civilizational deepening of social complexity is mirrored in the expansion of abstract representational technologies, then it is these technologies which make complexity both cognitively tractable and pragmatically manipulable. And it is these computational technologies which provide insights into how a post-capitalist society could reappropriate and rationalize the productive forces of society. And indeed, I think Hayek and von Mises recognized the key debate in the 1920s and 30s. The fate of whether we can move beyond the market ultimately lies in the question of whether or not we can intervene into complex systems in a beneficial manner. If we can't do this, then decentralized decision-making by individuals is the only response. But if we can intervene in complex systems without making things worse, then all sorts of progressive options open up. And so suddenly the question of rationally manipulating economies in the service of the commons becomes a live problem. So throughout all of this, we have to recall that the economy is not a natural object, but is instead a social and technical construction. So from the physiocrats' initial attempt to map the economy in 1758, to the development of national statistics in the early 20th century, and on to the elaborate computational models of the early 21st century, the economy has always been something to be constructed. And this construction of a visible economy, it goes hand in hand with constructing ways to manipulate that economy. Given that states act upon economies on the basis of their understanding of the system, and that this understanding is broadly, although not completely, embedded in the computational medium of macroeconomic models, then shifts in these models both reflect and cause shifts in the ways that states manipulate economies. So modeling is therefore a crucial medium bridging conceptual understanding and pragmatic manipulation. So therefore this paper is interested in the sorts of affordances that these models offer and the politics that they embody. Now that being said, these models are not simply simple determinants of politics. They instead provide a mechanism for organizing thoughts about the economy, for suggesting a range of possible futures, simulating these sorts of things, and they're always supplemented by expert judgment. Now, in accomplishing their functions, models employ a type of thinking embodied within machines. In particular, they construct and embody abstract formalizations of conceptual systems. They operate by combining various elements together in a somewhat partially flexible way. So, for instance, they link together analytical definitions, empirical regularities, local context, universal principles, disciplinary laws, and concepts into some sort of consistent whole. And these elements, while permitting of some flexibility in how they are put together, are nevertheless constrained in terms of how they can produce a model. And part of this constraint comes from the medium through which the various elements are linked together. So a mathematical formalism, for instance, permits of some linkages, while the use of paradigmatic examples as a model provides other means. Now, I think in discussing sort of models, Mary Morgan's work has been particularly exemplary in demonstrating how model-based reasoning functions. So I think it's in her work that we see how models gain their cognitive power, in particular by embodying two general sets of rules for manipulation. So first, there's the rules imposed by the material of the model, and second, there's the rules imposed by the subject matter of the model. So in the former, the material can be considered physical, for instance, models that attempt to build scale replicas of the phenomenon, but it could also be ideational material. So models built in a particular algebraic language or a particular programming language, for instance. But in both cases here, one is bound by the rules of how one can manipulate such material. You can't just manipulate in any way. Now, the second broad set of rules comes from the subject matter itself. So the theoretical concepts and their interrelations that the model builders have implemented into the technology. And now, a consequence of the two sets of rules imposed by modeling is that one can have a precise pathway for following a chain of consequences. And on the basis of this, what gives contemporary computational models their peculiar power is their capacity not only to organize, but also to outsource cognition. So while organizing cognition is a virtue in itself, It is when these rules and chains of consequences are outsourced into a computational medium that they take on their uniquely modern power. So with such a representational technology in hand, one can allow the calculative and inferential processes to expand far beyond any human capacity. So models therefore solidify certain rules of thought into them and ramify the conceptual linkages. And this consolidation of a particular state of knowledge is a source of both their power and their limits. Now, in addition to this, models also perform a certain social function, which is namely to convince others. And in this regard, the construction is also a means to transform a purely sort of conceptual argument into a medium for propagation and persuasion. And this is more than just the argument that numbers give an illusion of certainty and precision. The point is rather that the very path of reasoning is altered and made more palatable or not, depending on the medium through which it is made. So the point to be taken from all of this is that models condense a set of inferential and material rules into a medium political consequences of log linearization within dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. It turns out, actually, this technical issue is a highly political issue as well. Now, in the longer version of this paper, I cover the Soviet use of economic cybernetics, the Chilean use of a communist internet, the firm-level planning of global corporations like Walmart, and the global modeling of institutions like the IMF and the BIS. In this version of the paper, I'm only going to have time to give a very schematic overview of capitalist modeling within central banks. Now, it's quite common to believe that we live in a post-planning era. Communism has failed, and neoliberal doctrines of privatization have taken over. Yet planning still exists in significant areas of even the most neoliberal capitalist economy. And this planning exists on at least three levels: state-led investment, firm-led planning, and state-led monetary interventions. Now, in particular here, it's the third form of planning, which is the focus of this analysis. The use of modeling and other technical tools in order to construct an image of the economy to generate levers for manipulating the economy through monetary instruments. In particular, the focus is on the use of these theory-heavy models called dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models, or DSGE. Now, central banks also use a variety of other representational technologies, things like vector autoregression models, which are highly statistical, large-scale macroeconometric models, leading indicators, and economic surveys, mostly. But that being said, it's DSGE models which have become the workhorse of most forecasting. So notably, though, on a sort of side note, most private firms, like an investment bank, for instance, don't actually use DSGE models to model the economy. The only times they use DSGE models tend to be when they want to forecast what the central bank is likely to do. Instead, sort of anecdotal evidence that I've gathered suggests that many investment banks, for instance, take a much wider approach to modeling, incorporating models based upon heterodox economists like Kalecki, Minsky, and Godley, for instance. So it's quite interesting, I think, that private firms, the ones who are actually making money off the markets and off the economy, use heterodox economists to actually model what is going to happen. So all that being said, returning to sort of central banks, what happens when we look at the historical record of central bank modeling? We see that the representation of the economy and the construction of levers of the economy go hand in hand. So when stagnation hit the mature economies in the 1970s, government intervention, primarily fiscal, was initially justified by virtue of the classical Keynesian models of the time. But with conceptual and technological development, the 1980s brought a series of monetarist models which constructed new levers over the economy. This is partly why they were adopted at the time as well, is because they gave policymakers new levers to try and combat stagflation. Now, as continued conceptual and technological development occurred, new levers were constructed via the new Keynesian models, and by the mid-2000s, these DSGE models were widely taken up by central banks. Now, there's a number of sort of problems with DSGE models. My longer paper goes through some of these, but for here, I just want to sort of point out one, which is that the notion of equilibrium being central to DSGE models, and in the sort of practical use of these models, this particularly means a single equilibrium rather than multiple equilibriums. So on the basis of this, the research question becomes, for a DSGE modeler, becomes what explains the fluctuations in the system? In these models, there's only external shocks which are responsible for upsetting the otherwise perfect balance of the economy. So by contrast, post-Walrasian models emphasize that the economy is subject to chaotic behavior, while something like the Minskyan approach would emphasize the tendency towards financial instability. And the Marxist approach, of course, would emphasize that the tendency towards crisis is just built into the economy. So this sort of focus on equilibrium and a single equilibrium within DSGE models already negates the possibility of even asking these questions. So in these latter cases, the Marxist and Minskyan approach, the question instead becomes not of explaining fluctuations, but instead of building institutions, rules, and programs to constrain a naturally chaotic system, or in other words, to build social movements to move to a new economic system. So I think the sort of reliance upon DSGE models essentially forbids all these sorts of questions from the outset for a central bank, and therefore determines what they do and can't do in terms of intervening. Now, in discussing all of this, I don't want to say that modeling is a panacea or that it is independent of human cognitive systems. These aren't, this isn't a technical sort of solution to a political problem. Rather, they're sort of situated in a much broader sort of community of socio-technical reasoning. And all the models invoke exogenous variables, and they require implicit and explicit assumptions. And moreover, these models are subject to constant conceptual revision as the economy changes. To give one example, the Bank of England recently spent £3.4 million on building a new model. So these things are constantly being changed all the time. And models are therefore an important part of a socio-technical reasoning process in setting monetary policy. And as every personal account from a central banker attests to, forecasts from various models act as hubs around which discussion centers. So there's sort of iterative processes of forecasting and discussion, along with inputs from the expert judgments of the members. And the role of expertise, I think, comes in a number of places in the socio-technical reasoning process. So the Bank of England, for instance, it incorporates more frequent information, such as business surveys and other leading indicators. It incorporates this information via the judgment of members of the committee, rather than directly through the core model itself. So human reasoning comes in via the summarization of variables that cannot yet be computed. And since no single model is a perfect representation, there's also model uncertainty. Now, in part, this uncertainty is minimized by using multiple models. So this is similar to the recent shift to ensemble modeling in the climate change sector as well. And if models agree on the implication of a shift, if you use a bunch of models and they all agree on the shift, it can be considered that there is little uncertainty, but if they disagree, then obviously there's quite a bit of uncertainty about the models. So further estimation of how uncertain a model is, though, it also depends upon human judgment, relying on past experience to know the idiosyncrasies of a particular model, in areas where it often over or underestimates effects, for instance. So I think this is a second way in which the human judgment, human cognitive reasoning, gets incorporated into these technical models as well. Now lastly, and perhaps most importantly, human reasoning interacts with models at the level of assumptions and in the setting of parameters. So DSGE models constantly require parameterization, which is the setting of certain variables. And these parameters are usually set by historical data, but key information is also derived from expertise, microeconomic research, and Bayesian statistics. So human reasoning has an important role to play here as well. And model-based reasoning is ultimately incorporated into a larger socio-technical form of reasoning. Now it's here that the study of modeling, of how modeling, socio-technical reasoning, and the manipulation of the economy link up. I think it's here that they link up with the problematic of a post-capitalist society. So we've seen the various ways in which the economy is being automated and augmented by technological developments. And we know from philosophy of technology that technology is not neutral. Embedded in the design and function of technologies of particular political affordances. And even if these affordances are not exhausted by any particular political orientation. But if these technologies are not neutral, then they become a terrain of contestation for any sort of politics. The design and function of the individual technologies and the large-scale infrastructures of society, these are all open to being mobilized in different and post-capitalist ways. So given that planning in economies is increasingly ubiquitous, the question to be raised is what can be done with this state of affairs. Now Marx famously argued that the increased centralization of the productive forces would facilitate the transition to communism. Now can a similar claim be made in regards to the construction of computational models, and models that manipulate the economy in subtle and significant ways? So in other words, can these models be put towards collective ends? And my wager here is that not only is this possible, but it's also necessary. Recognizing the limitations and political nature of current efforts, the open sort of research program involved here is of how to build and repurpose cognitive assemblages for post-capitalist and democratic ends. And ultimately, the aim here is to recuperate one of the traditional and now largely forgotten arguments for communism, which is that not only was it a more equal society, but it was also a more rational, efficient, and productive society. So in the end, socialism or barbarism. That's it. Thank you.
I'm just going to introduce you, and then you're going to introduce me. So Mo's going to pop up here and introduce the keynote for today's morning session, and then we'll follow that with a response. So welcome, Mo.
Yes. Thanks for bearing with all the technical difficulties and like glitches and stuff. Michael may join us later to sort of finish what he was talking about, but I think Michael's and Nick's kind of went well together in terms of the necessity of trying to get over our ontological critiques of computation and try to somehow use them consciously and correctly towards some kind of solution. Now, talking about modeling and solutions, I wanted to sort of say a few words about Sohail and talk about how we sort of intersected and met. And me and Sohail met in person last year at the artist space. Sohail was there doing a residency, a 4-part sort of lecture series, which all of them are online, 4-hour YouTube videos. The topic was on the necessity of art exit from contemporary art. So art's exit from contemporary art. And this is not a mistake, that's what really he meant. And in the series of talks, Sohail kind of laid out what are the sort of problems with the notion of contemporary art and how art can sort of salvage itself, so withdraw from these sort of problems. And then I also knew that Sohail had an interest in a couple of political economists that had worked with the material before. People have been reading and kind of communicating, and I would have loved to actually have them here too, but Jonathan was too busy. The names are Jonathan Nitzin and Shimshon Bichler. They're one of them teaches at York University and the other one at the University of Tel Aviv. And they're sort of magnum opus of the book that they kind of put forth their ideas. It's called Capital as Power. And so it's an update on a classic Marxism and kind of try to create an immanent theory of political economy in which divisions between politics and economy, or fictitious economy and real economy, and the sort of privileging of labor theory of value are kind of questioned. And instead of the old school Marxism, they kind of propose something, and their proposals are quite controversial in both the world of culture but also economy. But me and Sohail have this common interest in them. Sohail did a very interesting piece about them called Tainted Love, which is with another writer, Phillips. So that's how we sort of met. So I'm also gonna read Sohail's biography for you, and then we can. Sohail Malik is 2012 2014 visiting faculty at CCS Bard, New York, and program coordinator of the MFA Fine Art Goldsmiths, London, where he holds a readership in critical studies. Recent publications include co-editor of Realism, Materialism, and the Flood of Rights, The Value of Everything in Text zur Kunst, The Ruling Elite Have Feelings Too, in The New Reader, Abe Says No, in Red Hook Journal, and then On the Necessity of Art Exits from Contemporary Art at Artospace. This is like the talks, the 4 talks, and many, many, many more. So I would like to welcome Sohail. The title of Sohail's paper is Information Technology.
Okay, fine. All right. Okay, thank you, Mo, for the introduction, also for the invitation to be here. I usually have a PowerPoint accompanying my talks, just to make them more comprehensible, but I didn't have time to produce that today. Okay, the received criticism of instrumental rationality is by now well established. It's a mode, instrumental rationality is a mode of calculative production of control, or control organized by externally set ends, stripping subjectivities, communities, collectivities, and projects of this self-determination or autonomy, kind of critique that's been at the base of many of the presentations we've heard so far. Systematization and expropriation take command, number, calculation, generality, and substitutability deny if they do not repudiate or even vanquish singularity, autonomy, particularity, and locality. Quantitative requirements supervene upon qualitative considerations and conditions. The logicizing constraints of rationality supervene upon creative irregularity of freedom or upon ethico-moral obligations. These amongst many such variants. The locus classicus of this distinction is Plato's banishing of the artist from the political organization of the city, which Plato presented in the Republic from about 380 BCE. Now, this expulsion by Plato is required because the artist's skills and mimesis threaten the integrity of the national political hierarchy. The artist can sort of slide between the different hierarchical distinctions that Plato wishes to construct for the functioning of the good republic. The locus moderna of this this axiomatic distinction is presented in Immanuel Kant's Critique of Judgment Power from 1790. In Kant's specification of aesthetic judgment, which takes place without external ends, it's purposeless, and in this is distinct to judgments of the understanding determining particular sensory experiences according to concepts regulated by reason. And from industrial modernity to post-war managerial capitalism to now, this distinction and this condemnation of instrumental rationality that follows from the distinction have become the organizing axis for theorizing the repudiation, if you want, of classical modernity, of capitalist modernity, as the dominant exploitative and alienating formation of that rationality. Right? So in modernity, the critique of instrumental rationality is the critique of capitalist modernity, because capitalism is dominating, exploitative, and alienating. This is all familiar stuff. For all the differences between to bring it up to date, for all the differences between the now prevalent schools of critique, they commonly, if divergently, appeal against standardization, systematization, generalization, and calculability. What is common to them is the advocacy of asystematicity, the unprogrammable. Mention of the program goes right to the core of this conference, its stated theme, which I take to look to affirm what can happen on this side of programmed digital technologies in terms no less emancipated from instrumental rationality. And I take this construction, what can happen on this side of programmed digital technologies, emancipated from instrumental rationality, to be if you want, the core edict of what's now called accelerationism. In order to better situate what electrocomputational digital machines inaugurate, both in the marked developments of the systematicity and scale of the instrumental rationality over the past 40 years, and also, in addition to that, to understand what their transformation the transformation or even the repudiation of their logic requires, I think it's instructive to contrast them, electrocomputational digital machines, to contrast them to a praxis which assumes and in new ways operationalizes at every instance, the critique of instrumental rationality as its very condition, the praxis that is contemporary art. And if you were here yesterday, you'll understand I'm doing this partly because it's the burden that Mo placed upon me. It's the only speaker somehow speaking to contemporary art. Contemporary art, and here I'll rely upon the series of talks that I did at Artist Space that Mo mentioned. Contemporary art extrajects, objectivizes, and semanticizes Kant's criterion for the purposelessness of subjective aesthetic judgment into the art itself. Okay? So whereas for Kant, aesthetic judgment is a subjective condition of judgment, the claim is contemporary, this is a completely common claim, contemporary art objectivizes the purposelessness of judgment into the object itself. The object is purposeless. But it's not just the object, also the mode of address of contemporary art follows the edicts of aesthetic judgment. Contemporary art assumes the critical injunctions against instrumental rationality as a default condition, a requirement of all of its aspects, the object, its mode of address, its reception, so on and so forth, and also its economy, I should say, its market. And in doing so, contemporary art extends and mutates that critique of instrumental rationality beyond its modern formations. In general, and in particular, i.e. contemporary art as a whole, but also per artwork, contemporary art leaves space for the ongoing and ever-revisable making of meaning and action. Finding solace in post-structuralist theorizations, if not motivated by them, contemporary art in its critical dimension refuses, or at least tries to refuse, instrumentalization in all its dimensions, be it via soft, though networked and partially institutionalized, autonomy of art makers, curators, and writers, or be it via the open-ended constructability of meaning by art's recipients, who are often the first mentioned bunch of people, but also via the non-totalized and partial articulations of the art itself, which thus repudiates the well-defined message, the clearly determined message, or standard sense of information. So something about art's open indeterminacy of meaning, its constructability, both with each encounter of the artwork, which is what how contemporary art is set up, but also for the recipient, the addressee of the work, sort of seems to be dedicated to denying a common sense of information as the defined signal in a structured system. Okay? Contemporary art is not determinate, or contra the standard notion of information, contemporary art is not determinate or determining, closed down or closing down, univocal fixing, very much to and for the contrary. 3 points, I think, can be made around this. Firstly, if contemporary art communicates anything at all, it is certainly not information in the cybernetic sense of a signal that alters a system within designated parameters. That's a point I just made. Rather, contemporary art is a kind of generation of importantly plural experiences or knowledges that are rich, multiple, and reflective. In any case, irreducible to the schematics of information. Contemporary art advances a condition of what Bernard Stiegler calls interpretation, contrasted to information. And this is because, second point, contemporary art is an art of indeterminacy, okay, which is the central claim around organizing the artist-based talks. Contemporary art is an art of indeterminacy, which is to say that contemporary art is not the name of all art that is being made now or now-ish. Rather, contemporary art is a specific genre of art, precisely that art which observes and affirms indeterminacy. And the paradox of this genre is that it, as an art of indeterminacy, it proscribes definition. Okay? And I think this is what allows an identification, a mistaken identification of contemporary art as just the name of all art that is being made now, because it's definitionless. But I think insofar as the indeterminacy organizes, stipulates a certain type of art practice, a certain type of reception of art, a certain mobilization of art, including its marketization, it seems to me we can characterize contemporary art as a genre, as a specific genre of art. This indeterminacy and indefiniteness, or if you prefer indefinition, is not just the condition of contemporary art's operation, it's also its requirement, what it affirms, and what it is affirmed of it. Contemporary art that is too didactic fails as contemporary art, for example. Right? And the third point I want to make from this is that for all of these reasons, contemporary art is an all too appropriate kind of practice for what the sociologist Elena Esposito, following Niklas Luhmann and Ulrich Beck, what she calls societies at risk. This is from the book Future of Futures. Commonly translated as risk society, but she's very clear that there's a potential mishap in that translation. Societies at risk, for her, is the better translation. Societies at risk are societies that hold open and maintain the possibility of the revision of decisions, deferring finality, acknowledging self-reflexivity as a necessary condition for transforming past judgments, given the uncertainty of the future, given the change in understanding because of previous judgments, and also that judgments are always anyway constructed and subject to revision. Which is to say, given the necessity of change and the uncertainty not just of the future, but that any knowledge or decision in the past or present may or may not have been a good one. Okay? Acknowledging all of that, we open ourselves to revision. That's the main characteristic of societies at risk. Or again, for another formulation, in such societies, any and all knowledge, decision, or judgment is an ineliminable risk. Okay? You make a judgment or a decision to do something, you take it knowing that you may revise it in the future, because every judgment is a risk. Okay? Norms then, in societies at risk, norms are at best weak, as are continuities between past, present, and future, and no less continuities or social bonds between individuals, because they're all open for revision. They can be changed at any point. They're not strong bonds. Okay? Temporal bonds, social bonds are not strong bonds. Now, these three aspects, contemporary art is not a kind of cybernetic information. Because it's an art of indeterminacy, and therefore it's a good it's a good cultural project for societies at risk. These three aspects, these are just three aspects of one imperative. It is precisely contemporary art's indeterminacy that is at once its appropriateness as a mode of culture for societies at risk at their most structurally complex. That is, societies that are developed enough in their temporal, institutional, and intersubjective structures to maintain and further promote the revisability and incompletion of meaning. The proliferation of knowledge that makes contemporary art a propagator of semantic risk predicated on uncertainty. But we need to be more careful in making these standard identifications. That contemporary art promotes risk and therefore is anti-information. And we need to be more careful for two interrelated reasons. Firstly, sociologically, Esposito's account of societies at risk is made in the course of a theorization of derivatives markets as precisely themselves advanced modalities of self-reflexivity and recursive revision, which operationalize precisely the uncertainty of the future and the present, organizing that uncertainty in the case of derivatives markets, organizing that uncertainty in terms of the present by managing risk. Or equally, such markets propagate risk by, such markets manage risk by propagating it. And as indexed by the centrality of digital electrocomputation to the functioning of those markets, digital informatics is now primary in the practical organization, management, and propagation of risk, which is what I think Nick was just talking about. In broad terms, information cannot then be opposed to semantic risk. Okay. Prices on finance markets mean something as prices. The price is a risk, and it means something as a risk. Okay. Prices are semantic in derivatives markets. And the second reason I think we need to be more careful about a quick distinction between information and contemporary art and its indeterminacy is that information is also primary at the level of the theoretical rationality of finance markets as risk markets, whether or not they are electrocomputationally operationalized. And this is so because the construction of pricing dynamics on finance markets observe what's called the efficient market hypothesis, formalized by Eugene Fama, and Paul Samuelson in the second half of the 1960s. In crude terms, the efficient market hypothesis states that if all participants in the market have equal information, it is in equilibrium, the market is in equilibrium, with the returns for all participants matching the general level of the market, the average market rate. Gains greater than that average, which is what the participant in the market is interested in, and here we can think of Nitzan and Bischler's interest in differential accumulation. Gains greater than the average of the market can be made by some against others when there is new information. Okay? Information is a disequilibrizing, which is why it's risky, disequilibrating, let's say, operation in the market, because it introduces an asymmetry or inequivalence between traders. However, trading itself on the basis of that information cashes out, literally cashes out, balances out that differential informatic advantage, serving, at least theoretically, to restore the market to equilibrium. That is the market's efficiency. If you trade on new information, which is your advantage against other traders, that trading cancels out the advantage of that information. That's the equilibrium condition of the market. Now, so practically, through the digital operationalization, which is something from, say, the late 70s onwards, and theoretically, through the construction of the model of market pricing through the efficient market hypothesis, which is to say from the 60s, the complex systems for generating, sustaining, and managing risk via the praxis of derivative markets is constituted by information. Okay? Information is risk generating, risk constituting. Distinctly organized and oriented as they are sociologically, and in the model of communications they respectively advance, both contemporary art and derivatives markets are praxis advancing what Esposito calls the minimal continuity characteristic of societies at risk. Contemporary art does it through the repudiation of communication qua information. Derivatives markets do so on the basis of instrumentalized information. So there's some problem in the notion of information running through these two models. Now, the two, contemporary art, derivatives markets, cannot be directly identified. Nor does the indeterminacy of contemporary art fold into the promotion of risk by derivatives markets as its cultural correlate. The common complaint that somehow contemporary art is a plaything for the financiers and sort of people who work capital markets. Okay? What the comparison between them draws out is rather and only at this point that the indeterminacy mobilized to advance the critique of instrumental rationality's prescription of fixity and stability is now itself, that indeterminacy qua risk, is now itself a semantic risk, no less the terms of the operation for a complex financially fabricated mode of capital accumulation. Precisely what, from the left, the critique of instrumental rationality was meant to oppose. Okay? So the critique of instrumental rationality from the left, which is the contemporary art moment, kind of gets inverted, if you want, and sort of played out through derivatives markets. Assuming that the critique of capitalism is to be maintained, and I will assume that, several non-exclusive options present themselves. We ditch the first option, we ditch the critique of instrumental rationality, because it is not now the repudiation of capital accumulation, because the finance markets do do risk in order to accumulate capital. And what this would indicate is that capital accumulation is no longer dependent on instrumental rationality, i.e. we've left the industrial age. And this would also, this option would also explain contemporary art's servile and at best supine relation to its own success with regard to capitalization today, both within art and outside of it. The second option is we maintain the critique of instrumental rationality because despite it all, we maintain the critique of instrumental rationality today because it is a repudiation of capitalism, but it is badly made qua indeterminacy. I.e. we look elsewhere than contemporary art for such a critique, so we give up contemporary art as a place for the critique of capital. And the third option is we reassess the terms of the analysis because information is not what we thought it was. Okay? And maybe because instrumental rationality is not what we thought it was from the tradition currently governing critique. So the question here is the adequacy the political adequacy of critique for our complex societies. Now, the rest of this talk will proceed with this last option, that we need to rethink information, partly because it permits the other possibilities to be addressed, not simply as a matter of political preference, but also as a theoretical demand. A more exacting identification or distinction between contemporary art and derivatives markets is required than the correlation we arrived at earlier. And this exactitude that's I'm going to try and press has to ascertain if the respective constructions by contemporary art and derivatives markets as and part of societies at risk, as contributors to societies at risk, are little more than homologous in their fabrication of uncertainty, or if rather, and I think this is the case, there is a direct structural, systemic, or conceptual equivalence or identification to be made between them. Identification would require an account of instrumental rationality qua risk, not contra risk, but qua risk, that enables it to be apprehended as promulgating uncertainty rather than fixity and standardization. Okay? So what is the common notion of information as promulgating uncertainty that runs both through derivatives markets, which is how it's operationalized, but also through contemporary art, which is where it's negated and repudiated. What is required here is, in other words, a counter-theorization of information. And this will return us to a question of programming, and to come back to the thematic of this conference as a whole, what must be the incredible aspect of digital electrocomputation, which is its exocognitive operationalization of risk. Exocognitive meaning that which is outside thought. So the claim here is that digital electrocomputation inaugurates a mode of risk which thought cannot withstand or understand. Okay. Here I'm going to rely on an article I wrote in 2005. So I'll run through it very quickly. If you want more information, go to that article. Okay, Niklas Luhmann, who's the inspiration, if you want, for Esposito. Niklas Luhmann states that information is in general, quoting, an event that selects system states. Okay, information is an event that selects system states. Luhmann continues, this is only possible, the selection of system states, for structures that delimit and pre-sort possibilities. Information presupposes structure, yet itself is not a structure, but rather it's an event that actualizes the use of structures. So information is an event. Recalling, but more exactly locating Gregory Bateson's 1972 ultra-general definition of information as a difference that makes a difference, information is what is new to an existing structure and modifies it. Okay, that's the key point organizing the rest of this talk. Information is what is new to an existing structure and modifies it. Yesterday's news is not information because it is already incorporated into the system's knowledge, unless you have not read yesterday's news or not looked at Facebook for 10 minutes. Equally, information can arrive long after its signal is received. Information is the complex temporalization of structures. Okay? It's what's new to a structure and modifies it. So it temporalizes the structure. Three specifications follow from this general determination of information. Firstly, the structure delimiting possibilities by virtue of which a signal can be information is necessarily conserving. It conserves itself because it's modified, but it's modified. It is modified. It conserves itself and it conserves the information which it transforms into the terms of that structure. It's some kind of memory. Secondly, information intervenes and transforms memory. It is an event distinct to mnemic systems and order by virtue of being new to it, and it transforms the given order. Information is the transformation of memory. Okay. Information is a situated event that is necessarily inventive. We could call it eventive. And this is to say, again, that information events temporalize the mnemic system. Thirdly, if contemporary art advances differentiation in its constitution and operation, it is information. Okay. The proliferation of differences that make some difference, maybe not a grand difference, but some difference, which nonetheless remain part of art, that's the very definition of information in its broad sense. Okay. But only if contemporary art has a structure, which is where I think the claim that contemporary art is a genre helps us understand it as information. What is key here, through these 3 points is that as an abstract description of information, the mnemic structure transformed by information can be anything at all. It can be material, biological, neural, technical, rational, social, or some cross-section of these and other differentiated phyla of organization. All that is supposed in this account of information is a structure of some kind, a memory, that is transformable, mutable by what it is for it a contingent event, which is the information. In particular, for the human qua culture and the human qua psyche, individuated, the privileged name for its mnemic organization within rational traditions is knowledge. So the question is, how does information impact knowledge? How does it modify knowledge? This is the organizing schema for the received critique of instrumental rationality. Knowledge is distinct to information. But what it also tells us is that, as we know from the news, information transforms knowledge, or knowledge has a history because of information. Culture is an immediately obvious name for that history of order and contingent reordering of knowledge. Now, this is a sadly commonplace result after that much work, but I think it has a less obvious dimension. The commonplace is that information transforms what we know at the level of the content. This is the news, right? Information changes the content of our knowledge. This is a parochial, anthropocentric determination of information, in that it refers the assimilation of information to the mnemic system, which is knowledge. There is a change in knowledge. There is new knowledge. The more general determination, which is less parochial, which I think is harder to grasp, is that if information is taken to be the transformation of knowledge, then what knowledge is as such itself changes. Knowledge cannot be unilaterally predicated on the extant mnemic system. Okay. Knowledge is only that which is mutable by information, which information mutates, transforms. Information transforms the very condition of knowledge itself as the privileged mnemic organizational structure of meaning for the human at the level of the psyche, of culture, and of rationality. The contention here is that the name for that transformation of knowledge per se is instrumentality. Okay? So if information is the transformation of knowledge, which is in the rational tradition human prerogative, what I want to now contend through a superficial account of Bernard Stiegler's presentation of the genesis of the human is that instrumentality is the name for the mutation of knowledge by information. Okay. So turning to Stiegler's philosophical anthropology, mainly from Techniques in Time, from about 20 years ago, tools, as well as language and social organization more generally, are prostheses to the human body and mind, which also constitute external memories that socially and intergenerationally transmit customs, actions, practices, knowledges. If there is a tool, it's used in a specific way. That's the transmission of a cultural memory, which individuates a psyche, what he calls, following Simondon, transindividuation. Instruments and the rationality they code and embody are systemically integral to the constitution of the human being as having first a history of any kind, and secondly, semantically stable communication, and also thirdly, shared customs, including social and transgenerational continuity. You can think of language here as a tool. The human is then constituted without identity in itself, and in this exteriorization of its transgenerational, transindividual, and social memory, qua tools, language, and customs, as much as by its biology, qua internal or genetically organized memory. So for Stiegler, the human is both its genetic, organic transmission, but also its cultural transmission, primarily through the tool. Consequently, the development qua complexification of tools and social memory is the development of the human at the level of cultural psyche, at the level of culture, the psyche, and even the body itself. The human then is not just a biological being per individual or per species, but is co-constituted in its biosomatic particularity, precisely in its non-specificity, because it's tool constituted. It's constituted in its biosomatic particularity, in its biology, and in its construction of meanings, through the operation of the neural cortex, by instrumentality. The human is an originally social institution. Okay? So the human with Stiegler is a biosemantic complex, or again, it's an anthropotechnical complex. Tools, language, and culture, instruments, order and organize what and how the human is, what Stiegler calls an instrumental maieutic. And because it is detached from the body, the instrumental maieutic can develop and complexify at rates much greater than the human biological system can, which means that the primary channel of human development is technical, social, and semantic, instrumental. In these terms, if knowledge is the privileged name for the anthropocentrically determined mnemic system, that is, observing the diktats of the critique of instrumental rationality and privileging a tool-free human understanding as the organizing and primary mnemic system, then, as its external and constitutive transformative condition, the instrumental maieutic is information. Now, this is a complex point. Let me re-articulate it in 4 steps. Firstly, instrumentality is the primary channel for the transformation of knowledge qua human mnemics, and it co-constitutes the human qua anthropotechnical complex. Information, second point, information cannot be extirpated from the development, information cannot be extirpated from the development of that complex because that complex is just what the human is anyway. In fact, information is the primary channel for human development qua anthropotechnical complex. Thirdly, and this is the main point of this stage of the argument, it is not then that information is an instrumental relationship to knowledge, but that instrumentality is a mode of information. Okay? Instrumentality is a mode of information. And fourthly, at the level of this general idea, which is what we're talking about here, information is always greater than and transformative of what we know the human to be, even as an anthropotechnical complex. Okay? Information is always greater than and transformative of what we know the human to be, even given Stiegler's identification of the human as anthropotechnical complex. That is, knowledge is only information as it passes through the anthropomnemic determination. The critique of instrumental rationality is the repudiation of information in this sense. It's anti-human. Seeking to prioritize and maintain the mnemic organization of knowledge by repudiating its transformation by instrumentality, which is the specifically anthropotechnical formation of information. Okay. Seeking to maintain and prioritize knowledge by repudiating its transformation by instrumentality and technological rationality, which now means practically and socially information. The critique of instrumental rationality paradoxically diminishes the human in its anthropotechnical revisability, and it does so for a phantasm of the human liberated from its constitutive condition. Okay? So the critique of instrumental rationality repudiates the human qua anthropotechnical complex, and it does so in order to assert the phantasm of a human as non-anthropotechnically constituted. The critique of instrumental rationality is then an idealist repudiation of the human. This noocentric, if you want, cognitivocentric humanism is not even a regression, which at least would require transformation and thus informatic determination of the human. It's only anti-developmental, staticizing. If we do not repudiate the human, that is, if we acknowledge the general idea of information, what is information in the specific instance then of the program determinations of the digital electrocomputational signal? Okay? So the argument so far is a general idea of information. What I now want to do is to push this into the specific model of cybernetic information, which is central to digital electrocomputation, which is the basis of digital electrocomputation. Now it's here, I think, that the distinction, or the question of the distinction or non-distinction between contemporary art and derivatives markets is instructive. Now, with contemporary art, as noted earlier, as a promulgation and affirmation of a difference that makes a difference in general, and also in each particular instance of contemporary art as a situated event. Contemporary art is information. But what is instructive here is that in observing the critique of instrumental rationality, which it does as a ethico-political imperative, called critique now, and affirming its indeterminacy as a permanent access to structuration and determination, this mode of informatics called contemporary art repudiates the instrumental maieutic of the anthropotechnical complex, which is anyway its condition. It's in bad faith. If, however, the general idea of information is that it is the temporalizing alteration of knowledge qua mnemic system, contemporary art's diminishment of information is then a decomplexification and even a detemporalization of the anthropotechnical mnemic system by which it is nonetheless constituted. Such art is then correctly called contemporary art, not because it is the name for all art that is being made today, but because its detemporalization is a refutation of the future of knowledge. Contemporary art is contemporary because it is replete with evention, the events and the differences of contemporary art, but without strong temporalization. Contemporary art is a weak temporalization. The risk that contemporary art is and promulgates is but an indeterminacy of the reordering of present knowledge without affecting or mobilizing a future. And I think this is the common malaise many of us understand about contemporary art. It poses no future. Contemporary art is information without a future. Put the other way, the future is a risk, information emancipated from knowledge, to be avoided by contemporary art. Let's look then to derivatives markets. I'm overrunning here, but I'll be about 10 more minutes if that's okay. Derivatives markets manage risk too. Okay, but what they do, contrast to contemporary art, they promulgate risk on the basis of the uncertainty of the future. They're informatic in a strong sense. In the terms taken up here, that is to say, in the terms taken up or mobilized in this paper, what derivatives markets can then be seen to do is to affirm the general idea of information and its temporalization as the very condition for their expansion, meaning increasing speculative capital accumulation and also the increased integration of risk into expansive geotemporal networks of financial trading. Risk in these markets is the knowledge that the revision of knowledge, okay, risk is the knowledge, because risk is priced, and that's a knowledge, right? Risk in these markets is the knowledge that the revision of knowledge, information as a general idea, and its temporalization is primary. It's what's mobilized by derivatives markets, the primacy of the informatic transformation of knowledge, of price. That knowledge has to be and is only a revisable calculation presented as price. Via price, finance markets are now the structured mnemic system primarily organized towards their informatic revision. It is here that the general idea of information can be connected to the specific technical organization of information as bits, codes, and programming. The electrocomputational digital organization of information determines all information in terms of numeric technical convertibility. Information is configured as the inequivalence of one variable against another via common calibration that accelerates the conversion of information into knowledge. Okay? So what the processor does is it accelerates the conversion of information into knowledge, the structure and the hardware, the coding of the chip itself. That ultra-particular material systemic determination of information and the technical specifications of what we can call information-ready knowledge. That's what electrocomputation, digital electrocomputation is. Information-ready knowledge. In its conversion, in its capture, and its processing, all of this permits a massification of the scale of information processing and an intensification of its speed, organized in the derivatives markets in the service of pricing, which is another kind of information, and of course capital accumulation. So, contrasted to the diminution of information by contemporary art, derivatives markets expand and intensify information. They capitalize information as a temporalizing revision of knowledge, and knowledge is revectored almost entirely towards the future, which, from the present and with regard to knowledge, is unknown. Knowledge in such markets is conveyed by price, a number that is indifferent to what it prices. This is the Marxian, all that is solid melts into air, but highly instrumentalized and operationalized at micro fractions of time. Information is the change in price. But information in derivative markets, the change in price rather, in derivative markets can itself be priced. That's what derivatives are. Okay? They price the change in price. And what can also be priced are the rates and the range of changes in price, volatility. And these, the changes in price, can be themselves revised again and priced. Okay? Price is a medium in derivatives markets. It's only a medium. In these markets, information machines permit a near equivalence between the general idea of knowledge and information. Price is the name and operation of that operationalized threshold. The threshold between knowledge and information weakening to next to nothing. To put it in a straightforward way, if the revision of price is itself priced and then revised, and if price is the knowledge, is the kind of moment of knowledge in these informatic systems, or rather in these mnemonic systems, the revision of price is automatically built into knowledge. Okay? Information supervenes upon knowledge at the very moment that it's instantiated as knowledge. So through the material semantic operation of price on derivatives markets, knowledge is nearly at once. It doesn't collapse to zero. It can't collapse to zero because that would be to eliminate price altogether. Right? Knowledge is nearly at once informatic. Knowledge, qua the mnemic system that is the market, switches into primarily contingent determination. Information. There are two interlocked aspects of this contingent because informatic determination of knowledge. Firstly, with regard to the machinic integrating expansion of knowledge informatic structures that are finance markets, there's a massive expansion in both velocity, rather speed, and size. I can give you some numbers, but I think I'm kind of out of time, so I'll just proceed. The expansion of the speed of trading to what's called high-frequency trading, and also the expansion of the derivatives markets to, by the end of 2012, about $25 trillion in gross market value, which is the combined size of America and Chinese GDP for that year. This expansion, this massification, and intensification, we can call it an ultra-intensification. Both of these dimensions indicate that the only constraints on the expansion of what we can call info knowledge is the technical capacity of the processing systems and also, importantly, the regulatory conditions imposed upon financial trading. Okay? So it's material-juridical at this point. The second point around this near identity, let's call it near identity, of information and knowledge, is with regard to the anthropotechnical complex that is the institution of the human. The near equivalence between knowledge and information in finance markets and the operationalization of that equivalence qua pricing vectored towards capital accumulation is certainly the threshold of the instrumentalization of knowledge. But what that now means is that the mnemic system of the anthropotechnical complex is being re-engineered more with regard to its contingency than its stability. These are societies at ultra risk, if you want. The electrocomputational determination of information is then a rational organization, a logos, of contingency, in Greek, psyche. It is an information psychology, it's an information technology, which is also an information psychology, a rationalization of contingency, or rational promulgation of contingency. And this information psychology transforms extant or coming cognition insofar as they would be predicated on non-instrumental conditions. And this, I think, is my disagreement with the resurgent hardcore rationalist inferentialism of Ray Brazier and Reza Negrestani. Because they're dedicated to, not Ray and Reza, derivatives markets, Because derivatives markets are dedicated to capital accumulation, they are a particularly dramatic and politically demanding case of the reconstitution and vectoring of knowledge towards its contingent revisability. Facebook and other social media generate the same equivalence at the order of social subjectivity. In broad terms, information technology vectors knowledge beyond its biosemantic, its cognitive constraints, reorganizing as it does so the ambit of its anthropotechnical complex, also known as the human. In this condition, the critique of instrumental rationality requires the repudiation of the anthropotechnical complex, I've said earlier, but that complex is now determined by what, from the perspective of that critique, can only be an ex-anthropic contingency, a contingency beyond any human capacity to know it. A contingency that then remains forever unknown to the human. But that is just to repudiate not just the future of the human, but also the new chances of the future human. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's my pleasure now to introduce Martha Schwendener, who will respond to that lovely talk. Martha Schwendener is currently an art critic for New York Times. Her criticism has been published in Art Forum, Book Forum, Art in America, The New Yorker, Art Papers, Artforum.com, New Art Examiner, CCA Reviews, Time Out New York, The Village Voice, Splash Art, After Image, and others. She studied art history at Columbia and at the City University of New York and Graduate Center, and has a master's degree in fiction from the University of Texas at Austin. She has taught at Hunter College, the School of Visual Arts, Fashion Institute of Technology, SUNY, and the University of Texas at Austin, Rhode Island, School of Design, and Pratt Institute. She is currently a visiting professor in the art department at the Steinhardt School in New York University. Welcome, Martha.
Hi. Can you hear me? Yeah. All right. I think, first of all, I should say I've only had this paper for an hour and a half. Can you still hear me now? Okay. Yeah, the visual just went off, so I'm not sure what's going on. It's been a very long week here in New York, so I'm tired, and as you can imagine from what you just heard, this is quite a paper to be confronted with immediately. And the other thing I should say is I feel as if I'm almost the completely wrong person to be responding to this around very, very specific, and that's actually my
She cursed that she said I'm the wrong person, and then he just died. Jason, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Yeah, I can hear you.
So it just Martha's machine is off, right?
It seems to have frozen.
Yeah. So you know what? You may want to get in a chat and get Martha going. Why don't we? What do you guys think? I think there's other people on, and then they're willing to respond to. I mean, it was nice to sort of hear Martha's respond right now, but given the sort of constraint of what we're in, I would say let's just wait 30 seconds. If Martha can get back, we should try to sort of get other people to sort of come in and talk about the previous papers, because all the respondents are ready there for the previous papers. So then we just give Martha 5 minutes to sort of log out, log in, and so maybe decompress the paper a little bit further so she doesn't feel so put on spot. How about that? So, Jason, do you want to facilitate that? Because we have people from Michael Farah responding to the question of technology and education, all the way to what I mean. You had some students who wanted to comment on Ken's paper and others. So what do you think? Because you can just bring them in, because you have to just tell them and put their mics on so they can talk, and then we get Martha going again.
Let's start with the respondents who are
Okay,
who are already primed.
Nushin, are you ready?
Let me turn off her mic real quick. Hold on.
Maybe we should start with Nushin because she.
Hi, Nushin, are you there? Hi, Nushin, are you there?
She needs a couple of minutes, it says.
Okay.
So actually, let's just like improvise. Just like,
Okay.
I think maybe Martha's back on. There she is.
Yeah, Martha's back. Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, back on the normal. Sorry about this.
That's all right. Was that me or you?
No, it's
just technology. So yeah, I think you cursed it when you said like I'm not the right person. So then Google just went like, okay, I'm just gonna like give you a couple of minutes. So here we go.
It really depends on the connection speed at the originating location.
Okay. Am I the originating location? Speaking of information, or I don't know. I'm all set up, so it only okay.
Great.
At any rate, in terms of what I wanted to say, is just when I said I don't feel like the right person in some sense. When I'm sorry, I don't know everybody involved, but when someone just read off this laundry list of places that I write for, or have written for, I only write for one now, but they're very, very specific in every audience they address, in the type of work that they present, and you know, right now I only write for the Times, which, how is that specific? It's addressed to a 10th grade reading level, which means you're always working at you're just talking to people who know nothing about art, and unfortunately, everybody who knows everything about art and hates the New York Times. And, you know, it's an online circulation of 20 million people. So obviously, and it's not something you know, that's a whole other story, how I got involved with something like that. But the last place I also wrote for was the Village Voice. And the reason I'm mentioning these things is because the whole point of writing for the Voice is that it was ex-institutional, which creates a certain sort of art. It can be people working on boats or doing stand-up comedy, you know, as a sort of art form, or activism, which is one of my primary areas, and that's why I know this particular group of people on Facebook is through, you know, activism, and very specifically through Occupy. So the other thing I should say that's not on there is I'm actually writing a dissertation now, finishing, you know, I'm the late PhD on Willem Flusser, and so I'm very invested in things like the technical image and media theory, and particularly in its kind of, not in its genesis, because we're talking about the 80s and particularly sort of German media theory. What's interesting is that I was actually reading Abraham Moll's, you know, earlier this week, who was in the late 50s and early 60s, you know, it's not particularly looked at these days, writing about information theory and aesthetics and how you could connect the two. What's interesting, though, and why I say I'm the wrong person, is that I have a very specific reaction to the you know, contemporary art world or contemporary art. I just don't imagine it as monolithic or as one thing, and so when we go from there, I'm already stopped at the beginning that it's not one thing. And similarly, the human, I have a lot of problem with that. Or when I think of knowledge, I usually stick an S on the end. And so in terms of, you know, knowledge, the human, contemporary art, I'm a little bit stopped right there. And so that's why, you know, instead of going into Stiegler and figuring out, you know, instrumental rationality, I sort of wonder within the art context if these can be theorized in that regard. And the other place, of course, is that with derivatives, is that this was quite prevalent in, you know, in the United States. And again, within contemporary art, one of the things that you start to realize is that even though it's supposedly a global art world, that's just not true, you know. And so there are different not only different forms of work being done in different places, but different modes of reception that produce different forms of knowledge. And so if we can, you know, we try and make a sort of overall theory, but then the only way that it really touches down is in this sort of one layer, perhaps in the biennial world or something, where there's this kind of global circuit where there is a kind of a contemporary art world and a contemporary knowledge around art. With derivatives, one of the places that I did find, you know, interesting is that probably 5 or 6 years ago, there was a lot of that in the American art world of art historians looking to derivatives theory, and mostly to tie it with abstraction and very specifically in forms like how there was a lot of abstraction in photography at the time. And so it was a sort of formalist application of derivatives. At the same time, I think what I'm interested in this paper, which of course I've only sort of looked at very briefly, is almost more the idea of risk. And so tying that to an essay like Tainted Love in terms of, you know, either a sort of erotics of art production or this idea of risk, you know, in terms of the future, I mean, I think that's what particularly, you know, I think it's very difficult when we say we all agree. I can say the people that are gathered in terms of my Facebook universe around, you know, again, originating out of the Occupy movement is the idea that capitalism does not, you know, see any kind of future. Everything is done in the present. I would disagree that art, or at least the artists, any of the artists that I know, work with, write about, etc., think about art as predicated on a kind of non-future. That doesn't, that just doesn't strike me that way. Most people I know, they're not making, it's almost like they're trying to channel the present in terms of just speaking to a future. So again, I'm not sure I'm the right person to, I said it from the beginning, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to be responding to. Even in terms of the idea of art as a specific event, as a critic, you're the first person to respond to something, and you also know you're a very specific person responding. Part of what's frustrating about writing for the Times is that everybody sees that as a monolithic organization, and they also see the critics as completely the same person somehow, when they could not be any more different. You know, part of the reason I write for that paper is because it has a very, very big reach, and I could get things in it at certain points that I sort of couldn't believe, but at some point I was told to stop mentioning things like Occupy and things like that. Stop it, enough. So the thing for me is that as I said at the beginning, I am very invested in thinking about information theory. To take it back to something else I've been writing about this week, again, a very specific instance. That Willem Flusser, this person I'm writing about, was a technical advisor for the 1973 Sao Paulo Biennial. Now, the biennial was boycotted in 1969 because of the military dictatorship. But this did not mean the same thing. And so again, this idea of specificity versus like a sort of one definition, it meant one thing for the people like Hans Haacke and Pierre Restany who were boycotting it from outside of Brazil, and it meant something different. Do you still have me?
Yes.
Oh, okay, because I see something else on my iPad. I'm sort of wondering. I have like a whole different, speaking of temporalities, I have a different one. Okay, I'll just continue, and you can, Mo, you can, send me a text if something goes wrong.
We're actually all like quiet and listening to you. That's why it sounds like nobody's listening, but actually it's all like super listening.
Well, I have a whole other thing going on here, so I should put you up. This is even better.
Yeah, that is probably the YouTube video, which is like few minutes like late, but it's kind of live.
Got it. Okay.
Like live.
At any rate, I'll just finish up with this idea of the Sao Paulo Biennial, which is that so it was boycotted, and what was pointed out by people later is that that was fine for people who were already outside of the country, like Lydia Clark, etc. But there were other people like Mira Chandel, who did show in this boycotted biennial. What's interesting for me in terms of the application theory, the application of communications theory, however, is that for 1973, Flusser suggested, instead of the national pavilion model, which we know is, of course, the biennial model, that it's like the Olympics and the biennials, you know, they've got to be this, like, you know, organ for nationality, that maybe you could institute it on a communications model instead and have, like, different nuclei, etc. And which has, you know, been tried out and was later sort of adopted. And so that's what I'm sort of interested in terms of thinking about how this can be applied. I have a great deal of respect for this paper that's in front of me, but as I said, because I work with such kind of specific things you know, modes of delivery, that it's hard for me to kind of see it abstracted in terms of, and it's a very difficult thing to connect information, derivatives, and contemporary art, and then alongside that, the human future and knowledge. So yeah, that's where I should probably just end. I know, I don't know, if you'd like anything more, I can keep trying to talk.
I don't want to interject because I'm not like scheduled to actually talk, but the enigma, I guess, is to somehow relate, like, or create another layer of, like, another model, to use like Nick's words, to somehow relate these two, because we relate to both of these, so like particular and universal positions, particular being yours and universal being Sohail's, because you know what I mean, like his talk resonates. It's not like his talk doesn't resonate, but you also have, like, and in fact that's why I put you guys in a conversation, to somehow, like, hopefully today or later on in the roundtable with Jaleh, we can maybe somehow find a way to model this connection, you know, rather than just like giving up in frustration, you know what I mean? Which will again be sort of like kind of defeating. So that's all. And then we can just like...
I'm not giving up in frustration. It's good. I mean, I'm teaching a graduate seminar right now that's thinking about medium and media. And then I run into people around town there's some other people teaching the exact class. So what's interesting to me is I'm not giving up. I mean, we just read Gregory Bateson a couple of weeks ago. You know, we did. I have to say, we did read Wendy Chan, Lisa Nakamura. Catherine Hales, the entire, regular crowd of people, Kittler, of course, to start with. But, in the past week, we sort of switched back and we're reading Panofsky and Demisch, because there is a prevalence of images right now, and what you learn from being on the ground as an art critic, and everybody's said it in all these art fairs and in the current Whitney Biennial, there's a prevalence of painting. Now, I suppose painting was supposed to be dead, but that is a very specific form of, if we want to put it in these terms, knowledge or information. And the reason, it turns out, I think, gosh, am I the only person reading Panofsky? No, it turns out everybody's reading Panofsky, because we're going back to this idea of that sort of like, that's a very long regime, in terms of perspective. And, as Demisch calls it, the perspective paradigm. So I'm really invested in what we can get from information, from media theory. The reason I'm writing the dissertation I am, which is not on an artist, is because I think we are at this threshold of connecting media theory to art history, which of course is, got a little bit too tied to the market and a number of other things. But I think, I really, because in some ways you got me in a good place, I realize, on my iPad, I'm seeing how positively everybody's responding to this talk. And I'm thinking, well, I'm just going to out myself here. But I think it's pretty out already. I mean, I write for a major publication that I have to say concrete things about concrete objects. And so to think of it as contemporary art, I just can't, you know. So that's, I think, what you're seeing sort of played out, and I'm, you know, in some ways, you know, I think we can all learn from each other, and I'm happy to do it, is the certain poles of thinking around contemporary art, that you can be that specific or you can be very abstract. What I'm curious about, you know, after reading something like Panofsky, you know, yes, it has its very specific moment in that it's, you know, I mean, this is like the formalists, you know, and what it's, you know, gave, you know, rise to in Vienna, etc. But the reason that a text like that, you know, lingers and has such an impact on younger students, and I think maybe I'm having you know, a reaction to that too. I think it's bad faith to teach in an art school and say that art poses no future. Do you say that to people, you know, being educated and making art? Hey, everybody, go for it. You know, we'll take your money, but art has no future. But, you know, I don't know. I should shut up while I'm ahead. So, yeah, let's talk about it in the round table.
Yeah, we're gonna revisit this topic like at the planetary session. Okay, so let's get back. Like, we just have to like rewind in our memory and remember we started this talk not with I mistakenly said like Michael Farah, but with Mackenzie Wark. But Mackenzie Wark's response already took place, and that was Robbins. So now we're going to go to Michael Farah, and I think Deneb, you can take over if you want. Jason, if you can turn Deneb's microphone on, that would be lovely.
Oh, is it me now? Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Okay. Can Michael hear me?
Is Michael there?
Is Michael around?
No, Michael's not here because Michael had like a power outage or something, and his whole system went down, and he couldn't even answer the phone and all that. But this will get recorded, and Michael will see it.
Okay, great. Yeah, because I actually have I actually have some notes that I prepared for like to respond. Basically, just I think.
Just introduce yourself because
sorry. Hi, my name is Deneb. I'm doing a PhD at Columbia University in Latin American and Iberian cultures and comparative literature and society. Right now, I also teach. I'm teaching a class in Introduction to Portuguese Studies, which is basically a combination of like language course with literature, Brazilian literature, and looking specifically at like Brazilian theory on literature, media, technology, and you know. So the part that I actually want to talk about a bit in regards to Michael's paper, which is kind of like an admirable attempt to take up the question of computation in relation to education and the preparation of curricula. Also the ways in which education comes to be a paradigm or comes to stand as a paradigm, not only in terms of like information processing, but also in terms of information organization and representation of information itself. So I think one of the things that need to be discussed, first of all, is in a way kind of like the way we need a very robust understanding of what such thing as a universal program of education would constitute on. So not only in terms of like whether it is in terms of accessibility, but also in terms of context specificity and the way in which that you know, education has very sometimes like local demands. And I see him addressing some of this in some of this in his paper. The other question that I would like to raise or to just bring to the fore is the task of the educator in a computation-oriented paradigm, which in a way biases a bit or has a bias towards information processing. And the educator then is positioned as someone that has to like organize information in a very efficient way and has to be able in a way to bring to the fore the very principles of the organization of education itself, meaning that in the context of a classroom, how would that translate into actual practices? already we have as examples, I think, in a way, like if you would even look at like Althusser and his whole critique of state apparatuses and the ways in which interpolation between teacher and student tackle precisely questions of like actually like repetition and recursion, right? The ways in which learning and the success of learning and processing information involves sometimes extremely regressive practices and somewhat problematic ways of establishing relations between student and teacher. So I think one of the things that I would like to, like suggest that should be thought about is, one, social relations in the classroom in face of a computational paradigm. Two, the question of the bias towards information processing, which today obviously was discussed a lot. So, and the other question would then be, well, for the teacher's training itself, the way in which the teacher is already in face of the computational paradigm of education, the way in which the teacher is already called for to be able to manage and administer a very programmatic type of curriculum in that sense. I know Michael is also trying to deal with the question of where creativity comes in, and also confusion, which obviously anyone who teaches knows that confusion is a very common thing is actually an also very productive thing that happens in the context of a class. So these are just, I'm just trying to kind of like establish relations between the way in which computation favors correctedness, or the way in which it processes error itself as already being either like a foundation for precisely the recursion of a program, or something that sure does afford the student the opportunity of like evaluating and coming to the awareness of how the principles are working, and that becoming itself the goal of education. So these are just some of the themes I detected on his talk, and I would ask him in a way to elaborate a bit more on more about the social relations of the teacher and the student, and how it plays out with the ideas that he's proposing. So that's it.
Thank you so much. Nushin, are you ready?
Hello.
Hello.
Hi, yes, I am here.
We're just getting your camera on.
Do I have my camera?
It is actually on.
I can see myself.
We can hear you.
Hello.
Oh yeah, there it is.
Awesome. So can I start?
Yes, you can.
Okay, great. Hello everyone, my name is Nushin Rostami, and first of all I wanted to thank you Mohammad for making this happen. I feel very honored to be a part of this and responding to Michael's paper. So first of all, I want to give a very tiny information about myself. I'm an artist and I'm also an educator. Well, I'm specifically interested in Michael's paper because I'm an educator. I've been working in education industry for the past 4 years, and I've been dealing with so many different age groups, from toddlers, teaching language and art, to grown-ups, and also teaching at an elementary school or teaching at pre-K. And right now I work in a public school in Brooklyn. I teach art and to 4 years old to 9-year-old age groups, and in an after-school program. So it is extremely interesting for me to see the reaction of each of these groups of people who I interact with as an educator, and see like exactly what their response is to bringing in technology as a tool in more of a pedagogical model. So what draws me into this whole paradigm is just the fact that when I compare it into like the process of learning from the linear process of learning from books, how it's everything like every chapter it comes one after one, and then comparing it to the universal pattern that the curriculum that Michael is presenting, and how exactly these information would be organized in terms of so the student would be the front row of this, are the people who actually would be in charge of prioritizing the information, finding out what is exactly is relevant to them, is how, and then the teacher and the educator will be in charge of sort of organizing this information. But what comes to my mind as a question is sort of this linear coherent process through which we walk through the information. How are we creating that interactions between the students and also the teacher? And it becomes increasingly important to address this radical shift in this model of knowledge consumption in this curriculum. And this part of this curriculum is exactly how we navigate through this, the links and hyperlinks and this whole universe of a computer as a tool to sort of learn. And so, and I want to also talk a little bit about the notion of space and how I want to talk about the notion of space, how it's actually when it comes to when it comes to a classroom, when students are dealing with sort of a computer as a tool, as opposed to more of like a let's say sorry, I got a little bit distracted by the notes on the side. So when it is in the classroom, how students exactly. Mohammad, okay.
Now you're distracting me.
No, it's okay. I got distracted by you and the notes on the side. Okay, so sorry about the pause. So I'm interested to know how exactly this this notion of bringing in computer from more of an early childhood as a tool to start interacting with ideas of because when it comes to younger age groups, they not necessarily can react to text, and it has to be in different formats of like what Michael sort of referred to in his paper about bringing models of like puzzles or patterns, and so I want to know that how exactly we're creating these interactions between the students and the computer as a tool. I hope it made sense. I tried to verbalize it. Yes.
Thank you very much. Are you done?
Yes.
So I would say, Jason, who do you have ready? Because Joshua should be really responding to Nick at this point.
Okay. Well, I mean, we do have Joshua. Are you ready, Joshua?
Yes.
You are?
So I just had to turn on the sound there.
Okay.
All right, so I just have a short response kind of prepared, so I'll just get into it. Hello, thank you to Mo for having me and the speakers. Should I go?
Make sure you introduce yourself.
Yeah, I will. Hello. Thank you to Mo for having me and the speakers today for their thoughtful presentations. I'm an artist based in New York who works primarily in sculpture and other media with strong interest in philosophy. In the last year, I organized and edited a book called Dark Trajectories with contributions from Rezan Garastani, Ben Woodard, and others, which was released by named publications and includes the first published version of the Accelerate Manifesto by Nick Cernacek and Alex Williams. Today, we'll mostly be addressing Nick Cernacek's presentation. First, I want to state that I am largely in agreement with Nick regarding the necessity of planning. I do not believe that we can propose an alternative to capitalism without a developed alternative to its methods, and that any truly modern solution to the problems of the present must be willing to engage with the complexity of present economic conditions in a robust and technologically informed manner. There is no retreat from the Promethean condition. We cannot reconstitute the ashes from the fire. To attempt to go back is only a ramified manner of going forward, and to move forward without the full armament of our present knowledge and technical capabilities is folly. As Nick has outlined, we face challenges whose scope and complexity represent immediate existential threats. For these reasons, I also believe that the heuristic efficacy of models is needed. Contra Alexander Galloway's presentation last night, we cannot afford to base our decisions on a fully attenuated detail to the immanence of the present. This is a recipe for myopia in inaction. It is the mistake of gods and utopians to believe that we can achieve the fullness of the present in the present. We move forward as we always have, fallible and imperfect human beings, not gods, but armed with the clever tools which are the heritage of our sapiens. Models, as Alex says, are not true, but this is their virtue as much as their weakness, which allows us to recognize where they are inadequate and develop better models. Compression is the necessary evil of those who wish to act. Now I'd like to turn to some concerns with Nick's work and offer, as a friendly critique, two qualifiers I have regarding the details of his paper.
If you slow down a little bit, because the lag kind of makes it like compressed, so just slow down, take your time.
Yeah, sorry.
You're saying cool stuff.
Did I have to, should I go back with anything, or?
I don't know, just because you're getting into arguments, so I thought maybe slow down a little bit, that's it.
Okay. Now I'd like to turn to some concerns with Nick's work and offer, as a friendly critique, two qualifiers I have regarding the details of his paper, and hopefully he will develop his thought further. The question of value. How do we have knowledge of what the value of resources is in the cybernetic system which Nick advocates? Here I am thinking of Friedrich Hayek and his competing epistemologies. Hayek developed the cognitive epistemology, which outlines the fallibility of human knowledge, and which is in contrast to his epistemology of the marketplace, which uses the tools of pricing to coordinate human action across the social system in an elegant but minimal system that operates upon the deficits of Hayekian cognitive limits. But if the limits of human knowledge, in terms of allocating resources in a sufficiently complex social system, are incapable of producing the necessary knowledge, would technology be capable of playing the same role as pricing and coordinating action? How will that technology know how to value the goods it is coordinating, since, in many of Nick's examples, pricing operates as the fundamental quantity for their measure? And then my second point, affect and subjectification. This seems to me the aesthetic question of how we represent the alternative. The neoliberal regime is in part popular due to its anti-statist ideology. Freedom from the state is simple to understand notion of liberty, which can be seen in the focus on inflation and minimal intervention in the DSG model Nick outlines. A new politics must not only produce a new technical model for operating economies, but must also couple with new ideals. Perhaps the most developed statement in this regard comes from Manifesto in terms of freedom from work. This, of course, inverts neoliberal ideology, but also goes against the grain of a Weberian culture, which is deeply ingrained in the Western mindset. Here, then, I see a challenge, not just for Nick, but for the audience as well, in regards to how we might revolutionize our cultural ideals and develop a new commons around different affective values. So, that's all I have.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so we sort of like that. That's probably for like all the respondents. So I guess we can open up to some question. Jason, do you want to like bring in some of your students?
Yeah. We have a student, Alex Kulik, who's also a student at University of the Arts in Philadelphia area, and he would like to pose something. Are you there, Ox?
I am indeed.
Great.
So I guess everyone can hear me. I'm live. Everyone's listening.
Yes, we can.
Yes. Yeah.
Just maybe get a little bit closer to the microphone, but we can hear you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Just wanted to mention how much of a crazy experience it's been the last couple days. It's around 9 p.m. when we started here in Philadelphia with another GCAS student here with me, and it's just we've pretty much been up ever since. We haven't slept, and it's been really an incredible experience. I'm no longer a student at University of the Arts. Actually, I was only there for a short time. My name's Alex. I'm primarily a musician in the Philadelphia area, mostly concerned with improvisation, I guess, as an expressive medium for the most part, and jazz, and mostly rooted in jazz, and specifically for me, the sort of period in the 60s and the opening up and blah, 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 blah. So I just want to preface with the fact that, I am so far from an expert in a lot of the theory-based things that are going on, and a lot of the I guess like citations and things like that. But I've been reading the pieces that Jason has provided for us for the conference, and instead of approaching it from a theory central thing, I just wanted to maybe bring up a few points that just because just being an improviser and working with people so much, you're looking at what people are saying musically and otherwise, how they're communicating with each other, and how they're spinning off rhizomes and integrating or fighting and all that stuff. I guess I'm mostly going to talk about the work piece, the spectacles of disintegration, and maybe pose some questions about education and things like that. The first interesting thing to me is that it seems like with everyone, even with all the dense talk and going so micro with micro and macro with a lot of things, it's still like we have this this sort of like fight between moving, trying to be so careful of, I guess, like the neoliberal regime in terms of we have all of these large, expansive, sort of like abstract and open possibilities, but we don't want to lose the vigor and the responsibility and those kinds of things in the face of these sort of like easily taken in and easy to get drunk off of ideas, I guess. And coming from I guess like a jazz tradition, the remarks in Reza Negarestani's piece, The Labor of the Inhuman, about the space of human being something that is revisionist and is sort of like a game, and the space that is open to error and open to building upon steps, even if we trip and fall. And so I guess I'm wondering where everyone lies in terms of reason, in terms of and my kind of just sort of like a lot of these talks, at least Negarestani's, lays back on this reason as a cornerstone in a way, and I want to know, we're talking about defining human as being this revisionist thing. What about reason? And then, in terms of media, because we're opening up into all of these new forms, so much so that, and they're proliferating so fast that they're, this giant plane is opening up, and it's so open, and there's so many things left untampered with or undefined, I guess. Is the space of what we're concerning or what we're regarding as reason also revisionary? And then how do we take all of these new avenues that are opening up with media and making sure that they are not, they don't become calcified in the way that I think sort of Wark is articulating in his spectacles piece. How do we keep them from being calcified in the same way that the spectacle has, in the point where we're at a point where things are so oversaturated and have proliferated to such an extent that, I think he says at one point in the piece, even the people that were sovereign and the people that had control over those mechanisms they don't even know anymore. They've also sort of left it to go, I guess. And I'm wondering, in combination with sort of the Deleuze-Guattari kind of thing of opening up a new way to think of. I'm so bad at wording these things. Opening up a new way to think, and in terms of, I automatically think of the rhizome, as many connections as we can make, sort of it being this sort of like this multiplicity structure, that kind of thing. How do we bring media into education and into the world in a way that is, once it's established, in a way that maybe a greater population can see, outside of philosophy, outside of critical theory? What are the steps that need to be taken? How do we approach it so that it becomes a rhizome platform? That it becomes something that isn't whitewashed, something that isn't so root tree systematic in place. That's really all I have, I suppose.
Thank you very much for your comment and question.
Thanks.
So if Jason, you don't have anybody, even if you do have somebody, maybe we should take some questions from the floor, because we would like to break for lunch in about 10 minutes. So there's time for some questions or comments. If somebody wants to come to the microphone, we can take your question. Lunch? Okay, so if we're gonna go for lunch, let's see if anybody else from the participants. I guess not. Let's go for lunch, right? Yes. Go ahead. You want to get to the microphone so your voice goes over to the people who are like. You can actually come here so they can see you. Yeah. No, come here. Yeah, because it's important that they hear you too, right? So you can either do it here and be seen, or you can do it there.
I'll stand beside you.
Yeah, come here.
But no, I just thank you for everyone's thoughts and for all the speakers and the respondents. My head is spinning from all this information. I just had a question, maybe just to put it out there, but there was mention of social media and Facebook, and I was just wondering for Sukhail and Martha?
Yeah.
About their thoughts on social media with respect to what you've discussed about, this idea of the anthropo-technical process and the individual's presence within these sort of matrices that you've described. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that. I know Martha mentioned something about an Occupy movement Facebook page that she's part of, so yeah, just wanted to ask about that.
Sohail, do you have something to say? Well, actually, can I answer it a little bit? Well, Sohail's not even on Facebook, but we all suspect that he is on Facebook with an anonymous spy account, because every time he talks to me, he knows things about my Facebook, and I'm like, how could you see or read those things if you're not on Facebook? So I guess he is there, but anonymously. But in terms of the rest, the interesting about Facebook is I'm going to be brief. There's this, and I'm speaking from the position of the sort of a medium expert, because I use it a lot, and people here know I use it a lot. I can see both sides of these things operative. You know what I mean? On one hand is this notion of pricing the risk And risk, it's an operation in Facebook. You could immediately lose all your fans who would like your pages or participate in your activities or like comment on your thing and raise your sort of like social media clout. And you somehow like without any kind of like guideline, you will learn a way to sort of like manage this risk and sort of like expand your clout by saying things. And so basically what Sohail talks about is actually an operation in Facebook. But then there's another layer of Facebook which is sort of like very like particular, and that's sort of like your core groups of people that you sort of like share like sort of like very specialized interest with. And those people like consider is a different level. That on that level you're sort of like you're really using it for its like emancipatory potentials. And I'm sorry to say that those potentials coexist with sort of like Chatelet's notion of internet is a system for worldwide domestication. Like I can see how that is right, and how a tool like Facebook is sort of like domesticating us in a form like turning us into cattle, just to quote directly from Chatelet. But also at the, but you want to come here? Pardon me? Yes. Yeah. So and then on the other side, there's this sort of like, but the only point I wanted to make is like there's another stratification taking place with technology, which is sort of like the 1%, but it doesn't like map itself onto the 1%, 99% of economy, and it's sort of like it's the sort of like technological intelligence, which is sort of like divides and it creates a 99% and another kind of 1%, 99% who just basically use technology as sort of like this robotically, and then another 1% who like uses the very same conditions that's supposed to turn you into like a kettle, and they use it against it. And this sort of like divide, its effect could actually be sort of like thought of as like a potential for change, because it's not like people who use technology to really advance the way they kind of like think and the way they kind of like produce knowledge. It's kind of like emancipatory. So that's sort of like that type of 1% I'm very interested in. And I think we can expand that. It needs that use, like the power and money of 1% and 99%. It can kind of like get expanded through like practice. So you have more percentage of that, rather than this sort of like majority of people being like just sharing like dumb like little things with text on it that you see, and people who really are contributing or people who are really utilizing it to sort of like generate stuff.
The comments on Facebook were just in passing, sort of towards the end, but in a way, what they exemplify is like the core point I was making towards the end around the near identification of information and knowledge. So it seems to me what happens in what I've been told about Facebook and the daily, the minute-by-minute postings, is the way in which there's a constant revision and reiteration of one's name or one's sort of Facebook presence. And the issue there is what is being presented on Facebook through the post, right? Is it a subjectivity which communicates something, or is it the revision of a previous post? And that's what constitutes the subjectivity of Facebook. And it seems to me it's the second. So there's a construction of a subjective position, which is the person behind the Facebook post or the stream, the newsfeed, who's organized through the revisability of what they say, right? And that seems to me exemplified the condition of this risk. It's like a risk subjectivity. The risk isn't a major existential risk because there's a bunch of crap usually, or you know, just kind of witterings, sort of, yeah, it's just witterings that are going on, some of which are more important, some of which are less. But it doesn't matter in a way what the content is. What matters is the velocity of revision. That's a strong Facebook presence. So, and I think this is where I've got a qualification of what Mo proposes, which is I think that the people who use Facebook most emphatically in the most interesting way, which is in kind of the way they use, in fact, which is a constant. It's sort of updates, but the updates are also somewhat molecularized or atomized. There isn't a sense of, there's a sense of a strong, let's call it subject position behind the posts, but the posts don't agglomerate to an identity, call it that, right? So there's a kind of fragmented manifestation of a subject position qua personality, which doesn't amount to something that you would call knowledge. Right? It's not a knowledge-based production, it's an informatic production of subjectivity. That actually seems to me the most interesting use of Facebook, right? Which is where I agree with you. But it's also this near identification of knowledge and information. Now, the issue is this progressive, is regressive? I'm not sure. With Stiegler, who I'm using as the main point of the argument, Stiegler's kind of very grumpy about the social networks because they're basically modes of capitalization. They're clickbait, essentially. And it's what Alex Gallo was speaking about yesterday, that every click is a form of, you do micro work because you provide capital somewhere. And also now we understand you provide sort of state, information to the state. So you're doing work with respect to capital and also work with respect to the state. So Stiegler understands this pretty well and is trying to repurpose, in a kind of, I guess, a proto-accelerationist way, repurpose social networks and digital technologies to do what he calls economies of contribution, which are sort of round up, kind of quasi-autonomous productions of new types of knowledge using the technologies. But this seems to me to follow a kind of critique of instrumental rationality account of the technologies. He's a kind of Malthusian in this. But it seems to me that critique kind of misses something else that's going on, which is the production of, let's call them contingent subjectivities, which are irreducible to the kind of subjectivity that he's calling for, Stiegler is calling for, through this repurposing of the technology. So because it's an already dense and complex paper, I didn't push this any further. But it seems to me that there's something about the contingent subjectivity, what I call a topological subjectivity, which is happening through Facebook, which is not reducible to traditional forms of subjecthood. Right?
So thank you, everyone. We're going to break for lunch and meet back here at 2 o'clock. It's actually we're 1 minute over our time, which is incredible given what we've been through. So we're going to close this. Let's close this hangout and start a new hangout at 2 o'clock, Jason. Okay? And this will just automatically archive itself, and you guys can go watch it in 1 minute if you want.
No, it'll take about.
Okay,
10,
so
yeah.
So goodbye.
Ciao.